Ladies and gentlemen, another Big Boys Table has arrived. Welcome to the Big Boys Table episode 72. In this grab bag episode, IskatuMesk and myself will be talking about a bunch of random things. How the hell are you?
I'm really tired.
Yeah, that's pretty, checks out. I also woke up not so long ago because my sleep schedule has... I always think to myself, you know, I have a bad sleep schedule. And then I remember roller skates exist. So thanks, buddy. Appreciate you helping me feel better about myself.
Yeah, roller skate. I mean, roller skates, at least he's had a consistent sleep schedule.
Yes, that is fair to say.
That's a lot better than me, or not been at all consistent, period.
Your sleep schedule is dictated by the coffee. I do think that the first topic we can probably touch on here is actually, it's got table in the name. It's a tabletop.
Yeah.
We obviously did Roundtabletoptalk, which is, again, greatest talk show name I came up with ever, probably. And the point of it was to start talking about our problems with the 5th edition of D&D and general problems. Like, I'm more experienced with 3.5, for example. And some people had some passing experience with Pathfinder, like Kia knew a little bit about it. And, you know, we were able to basically go through and talk about, like, the issues of dice rolls, the issues of, you know, if you remove them, like, what happens, because then you have to account for all the stuff that dice rolls do that isn't terrible, but, well, you just have to account for what they do anyway, because you're going to be replacing them. That's a common design problem. And then, yeah, we were basically trying to go over a bunch of details for how that would work, how the interactions most especially would work. And we sort of touched a little bit on stuff like, obviously there's so many topics that you could jump into from something like that. So it was actually a little bit of a challenge to, like, make sure that we hit all the points I wanted to hit. But I think at the end of the day, everybody spoke relatively evenly, so that was nice. And we were talking about the way to also fix progression systems as well, because, you know, milestone experience sounded like it was just at what everybody had arrived at as, like, this is way better than actually getting, like, granular XP points. You know, something that you mentioned earlier in that show is rules as written, you should just massacre the entire town or whatever at every stage because they give XP. And that's obviously like a stupid way to actually play the game if you're trying to be immersed in the world. I mean, maybe you want to be a roving pack of marauders or whatever, but that doesn't seem very reasonable in most cases. So I would say, since that episode, the update is that I did record a session of me working on my own, like, sort of setup for the rules, and I tried to break down some of the details for how things would work out. It's still very early, and a lot of the stuff that I have is, like, basically scribbling out some notes just for me to expand upon later on at a later date. But, you know, one of the things that I knew pretty much straight away is that a character would have a lot of its, like, abilities or, you know, proficiencies or whatever you want to call them. And I wasn't exactly sure how those would manifest into the gameplay either. But one of the things that I definitely knew is that what a character can do, like the ceiling of what they're capable of doing, would be dictated in part by, obviously, like, their what race they are and, like, how powerful they were in some sort of, like, physical sense, right? But also what their history was, and, like, what have they done in the past to earn the skills. And in that sense, it would be more like, sort of like how real life works, where, you know, you develop a skill by doing something over time, and it's not like, you know, Skyrim, where by jumping a million times you level up your jumping skill or whatever the fuck, because that's so stupid. But, like, it's more probably more milestone-esque in that sense, where if you you know, think about, like, the game master basically saying your character has earned a level up. Like, in this system, you would probably say, well, your character has earned some sort of proficiency in whatever specific granular thing they are trying to do. So you could imagine, like, a character that's meant to be some sort of hacker isn't familiar with a computer system of a particular race, but is familiar with, like, the basics that are universal about hacking, assuming that we could say for a moment that there would be universal basics of, like, how computers work. Because
Hacker
we
Man
obviously
2000?
Yeah. So that could be something that you would basically say, like, okay, you're proficient in hacking, like, systems from this one race, and you have a good baseline understanding of it, and so you're going to need to do, like, some decent, you know, I guess, trial and error or whatever to try to figure out, like, how to back engineer the other stuff, or you're going to need to, like, read some manuals or whatever the fuck. I don't know exactly how you would make that an engaging and interesting aspect of the game's role-playing experience, because obviously nobody really likes to, like, read technical documents as, like, part of your character. But that would be, like, one of the things that I was thinking of is, like, if you practice this, like, very niche granular thing, but it's not so niche that it's like not even useful. That would be added to your history as a character, and your history would determine like basically your overall capabilities and familiarity with certain things. And obviously, some of that also gets into the whole like metagaming thing, which I don't think we spent too much time talking about on the show. So I'm mostly just like bringing up a couple of different things that were downstream of some of those topics, and also updating people on the fact that I was like, actually working on this a little bit. And I did have a bunch of other like progress made on stuff. Like I kind of formalized the idea of body modifications, where you essentially have like implants or something like that fundamentally change aspects of a character's capabilities. These would probably be like trade-offs instead of just net benefits. So you might like replace one of your arms with something, for example, or you might like
a shoe.
You might get a shoe instead of having bare feet. And then, like, okay, you become less attractive slightly, but...
I meant, like, replace your arm with a shoe.
Oh, okay, yeah, you could do that too, I guess. Then you would become more attractive, right? Because that would be another foot. So.
Exactly.
So there's a lot of things you could do. I'm not 100% sure, like, where the upper limits of that are, but I feel like having a system like your history determining your ceiling and your, like basically having these intrinsic characteristics, and like the body mods can be changed and history can be made. Like you can literally just learn new skills in the middle of the game and stuff. But like for the most part, you would have a lot of like a baseline intrinsic setup that would give you your baseline capabilities. And then after that, you would add on to that with equipment. You would add on to that with like learning some new skills or, something to that effect. So that's sort of where I've settled on for like the progression thing. I feel like that still gives you a huge amount of opportunity to learn a lot of stuff. I don't know how much I have to formalize like traits or abilities or like passives or whatever, where something like, like in CMBW, you've got like this unit and like, it has this passive. And so like it does this thing. And that can just be like a trait of an equipment piece or whatever. If it's like a gun that pierces targets like the Cyprian, or if it's, something like that. But if you have this intrinsic characteristic, like, you're part of this race that has this benefit that like has some sort of psionic capacity. Like one of the things that I came up with for a character's attributes is like the idea of psionics actually ranges from race to race, where, you might have like one race has the psionic capacity to start like undergoing mental domination of the opponent. And another race has the mental capacity of like basically being able to, reshape terrain or something crazy, right? And so like these two are very different, but I kind of like classify them as the same thing because they're like otherworldly talents or whatever. So I basically just started to try to like lay out the systems. And so now that I've sort of got everybody up to speed with that, I guess I can turn it over to you, Mess, because after that show, we didn't do a second episode yet. After I get more details nailed down for this, I wanted to come back and do another one and maybe talk more in depth about character progression. But does anything that I referenced there jog your memory as far as like more things that you wanted to say or more things you had to say? Because I remember one of the things that we didn't really touch too much on was the metagaming aspect, and I feel like the metagaming can be pretty bad because not everybody can or even wants to put themselves in a situation where they can't get some advantage by like they're basically opting out. It's sort of like asking a sociopath to not lie in a way, you know what I mean? It's like why wouldn't I though? Like it would always give me an advantage, and it's more understandable for the lying case because like a moral actor wouldn't do that. But in the case of a game, it's like, well, it's not that serious, right? So like why wouldn't I just be like, yeah, my character somehow has divine inspiration to know this thing, even though it makes no sense for my character to know this thing. And one of the things I had in mind was, well, if you knew something that your character in universe wasn't supposed to know, like maybe the other characters, like the NPCs, would take that as like, oh shit, this guy's a spy or something, and they would like start distrusting him. You know what I mean? Like there would be like consequences to that. So that was sort of my angle for it, but I don't know if you had more experience with it.
I guess I'm kind of lucky in that the people that I play with, even if they don't have like a huge amount of years of experience behind them, haven't really allowed metagaming stuff to influence them too much. I have noticed it in some cases, but it hasn't really amalgamated in really major game stuff yet. I did give some examples at some point about when I run into that. But when it comes to actually building the characters, I think pretty much everybody is always going to try to build the strongest character they can. Sometimes you just get into situations where you're doing like, a one shot or something, you just do like a full roll for everything. You roll all where everything gets allocated, but then when it comes to like selecting your items or whatever, it's like, well, now I have something I rolled for, and maybe I've seen level 12 characters with like 50 health, which is like half of what they should have.
Okay.
And but then they still will try to make the most of that, and like maybe get an item that increases their spell DC or something like that. They did get instantly vaporized by a meteor shower at the end of the game, but
classic.
It's no, the vast majority of people, even when they're rolling for like there's a kind of a split. So I got people that will roll for health. You can choose to roll for health, or you can take the average. And we have people who will vehemently refuse to roll for health because it always goes below average.
Yeah, that does seem like what happens.
Yeah. And now when it comes to the metagame thing, it's kind of funny because we had, when I first started D&D, there was one person who was eventually introduced to that group who was absolutely obsessed about stats. Like, she just had to have high stats.
Okay.
And the reasoning for this that she said was because she basically hated combat. Because my guess was, and just judging from her the story time, is that the other DMs that she ran for, basically everybody except for me, didn't do combat well. She didn't like the way the game was balanced normally, and they ran fights very slowly, and I guess they were slow to resolve turns or something like that. I've never had that issue. And just this was a young person when their excuses, I want to get through combat fast, but it's also definitely about power tripping. Basically forcing a DM to let her bring in a character from an entirely unrelated game, from Pathfinder into 5th edition, stats and all that she had rolled for it, and these were like god tier stats. I'm not sure how intimately familiar you are with the stats within D&D, but basically that 18 is the highest you can roll for in a conventional 4d6 drop 1. I believe it isn't that. Yeah, it's 5. No, 4d6 drop 18. I can't remember. Anyways, I believe 18 was the highest of it. Maybe it was 5d6 drop 1. No, it's 4. No, it's 4d6 because it's 3 6s is 18. I'm Canadian. I can't really into math. Yeah, it's 4d6 drop 1. So her character had like 2 18s, a 17, and a whole bunch of other, like the other stats were quite medium high. So for standard array, I don't remember it off the top of my head, but I think like maybe 15 was your highest that you could get, and that was one stat, and then it was like 1 9, 1 10, 1 11, 1 12. If I'm not mistaken, like I could be very wrong, but it's a lot lower than what you can potentially get. But conventionally, when you run another game, you're making a new character. The DM doesn't let you just bring in something that had all these optimized stats that you claimed you rolled for this game. And, but it's just all about wanting to have that power. And then, of course, they're going to play an Unearthed Arcana class, which is also not conventional for this game. And very, very, very overpowered at that point before it got nerfed a lot. Unearthed Arcana basically being like an alpha. Do you think of like an alpha server where they just throw up shit and it's like, here,
it's like
whatever.
CMVW pre-release. Okay.
Yeah, it's a lot like stuff changes a lot in the. I believe I'm not sure if Mystic ever actually even entered official rules set yet. I don't know. I haven't followed it.
Right.
But anyways, you get people like that, and she couldn't she would not play the games without these high stats. Just had to have high stats. Whereas if somebody enforced standard array, which is the conventional rule set, she just wouldn't play it. And then we have HKS. And then HKS rolled his character for Starsworn. And I don't have his character sheet on hand, or I would give you the stats. But they're bad. They're really bad. Like, I don't remember the exact numbers, but you can kind of measure the results of your results in the array through total points that you got. And just to throw out in numbers, I would say the average would be 70, high would be like 85, low would be like 60, 55. HKS is very, 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 very low. Very, 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 very low. Only through being, what are they, level 13, about to be level 14, something like that, and the stat no multi-classing and stat allocation, has he actually managed to get his primary stat finally to +5 or +4? And then all of his other stats are just like absolutely terrible. But this is the thing. So HKS really doesn't care about that. Like in other games like God of Wind, he rolled well. But the thing is about these metagaming and these people who obsess about their stats within these games is you are still playing a game that is dictated entirely by dice when it comes to really flexing those stats. Now, when it comes to some things like passive perception or whatever, or depending on the DM who's running it, maybe your modifiers are high enough that they'll just give you the result. Like with Schwa's character in Starsworn, she literally has eyes in her asshole because certain perception things turn into higher passive perception feats and such. So I usually won't even roll contests where there's some kind of hearing or sight related thing where it makes sense to just say you hear this and you see this or you see something, right? I don't even bother rolling for it because it's just at the point where it's like he's going to notice it. Everybody else's passive perception is nowhere near Schwa's, so it's easier for me to decide that. But in a lot of cases, you try to move something, you try to force something open, you try to deceive someone, you're in combat, you try to make a save. That all comes down to dice. And the problem with dice is that they are random. What you're trying to do with stats is you're trying to pad out that randomness. But because Roll20 is PRNG, they have all this fluff about how, our system is true random. No, it isn't. No, it isn't. There's nothing true random about it. I mean, you're going to have repetition and galloping with an actual true random systems too. No, I've been with Roll20 for years and years and years. I've rolled just probably hundreds of thousands of dice or seen hundreds of thousands of dice. It's PRNG. And in some games, you're just going to be screwed forever. And you're never going to roll high at all. We go into Schwa. Schwa ran that game for us. This is one of the last games I played. And Loller Skates was there. And Loller Skates was someone who also rolled very high. I think Loller Skates managed to hit an enemy 2 or 3 times in the entire game. Not for lack of trying, but because every single time he would attack, he'd roll like 1, 2, or 3. And it's not like these low-level creatures had high AC or something. It's just he rolled too low. He had like a +8 modifier, and most people had like a +4, +6. He couldn't hit anything. We go into Autumn Winds, where HKS has Indomitable, which Kian did mention in that discussion. Allows you to reattempt to save. And yeah, like 2 charges of it. Mental Barrier, which was like a shield reaction to get advantage on certain saves.
Okay.
There was some others like shields to give more AC. And so he is running Eldritch Knight, which is, most people would say it's not a very good class, not a very good subclass, because it doesn't really give you a much. You are basically a fighter with spell slots, and those spell slots turn into resources. And more often than not, those resources get used for defensive actions, like shields or absorb elements or whatever. So all he really does is he sits there and he swings his sword and rolls dice. That's basically his entire character. There's not really too much more you can do than that. But one would conceive him as very optimized. It was basically metagame would be to put all your eggs into his basket because of the way he ended up, in which he got certain specific. He basically was like a loot whore. He just vacuumed up things and just ended up with things. So he had very high damage, very, very high AC, and the ability to at least reduce some elemental damage. And there were characters in the party that were outright tankier than him because there was like 2 barbarians and then a fighter cleric multi-class. And like, I forget what Loller Skates was, a ranger. I can't remember if he multi-classed or not. But in either way, HKS wasn't the highest mitigation tank, but he was basically like an evasion tank. So it was one of those things where when you reach a certain point, every individual extra point of power makes you that much stronger. Where basically like units had to normally crit him to hit him, or at least be near crit.
Yeah.
And there was one particular fight where I had about 20, 30 units minimum chasing him around or shooting at him. These were units with multi-attacks. And all this other shit, they could not hit him once across the course. I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 turns of just like 10, 20 units at a time attacking him with like 2 or 3 attacks apiece.
Well, isn't AC just kind of a
advantage.
retarded system anyway? Because you're literally not able to hit somebody. Like that's the main thing that honestly, like, the fact that the end game of optimizing your armor is you don't get hit unless somebody RNGs like a 2% roll or something. You know what I mean? Or
well, you see, this leads to stupid interactions elsewhere too, right? It's like one of the one-shots I played a while ago was run by somebody who believes that to make the game more challenging, you increase the range of auto retaliation that automatically hits with no check or save of any kind.
Okay.
And to increase like the health values of everything, and to just make it like more unfair.
Yeah, he's a modern.
So that was a game where I had very high AC at a lower level. I had like 23, 25 AC around level 6. Was it 5, 6? It was a lot. It was a custom subclass, and the way that he played it is we were fighting a fire elemental, and I attacked the fire elemental. And I wasn't sure if I was going to do damage. And I was like, okay, so what are the results of my attack string? And he says, oh, okay, you do damage. I'm like, okay, great. So I guess I'll use Action Surge, which gives you another set of attacks, and I'll just attack it again. And at the end of all that, he's like, oh, by the way, you get hit with 6 auto retaliation damage. It pretty much one-shotted me. So,
what the fuck? Okay.
Yeah, so that's usually how people will balance that kind of stuff. Is just, like I mentioned again in that other discussion, is apparently there's a lot of people who just put counterspell and everything to stop casters. I would rather just like fix the spells than just say you can never cast spells at all.
Yeah.
So
well, that just reminds me of when in the 3.5 DM rulebook or handbook or whatever it was, or guidebook. I don't remember what the fuck they called it. They called it something stupid. But the big book for Dungeon Masters were like, saying like, oh, a good DM doesn't do stupid things like as soon as a wizard learns Fireball, give them flame-resistant enemies, or and it's like, meanwhile, that seems to actually be exactly what people do, except it's way
that's
worse.
very common. Yeah. The other person I was talking about, the one who was really obsessed about stats, she would tell me about a DM that was the one that was running their Pathfinder game. Is they had someone else in their party that I guess they were like a paladin or something, and they had some kind of magical weapon. So every single enemy in the game had to have resistance against that damage type everywhere. Yeah. And just like, So
beggars belief at a certain point, it actually takes you completely out of the game, that like, oh, everybody's immune to this one thing that I have, okay.
With that sense, I've had a bit of a challenge because, as Kian will probably tell you, there is very few feats within 5th edition that are actually good. Okay. But the ones that are good are kind of really retardedly strong. The lucky one is one that he told you about.
Right.
But there's also one called Crossbow Expert, which basically gives you... This is where we enter the metagaming stuff, where it gets really stupid. So the Crossbow Expert thing is basically a power attack. You take a hit to your +2 attack. It's -5, but you deal +10 base damage if you do hit. So a lot of these physical builds will centralize around giving yourself accuracy, either Elven accuracy for double advantage, or getting advantages in other ways. Lolor Skates used Guardian of Nature, which was a spell, and he lost that to 1 damage on concentration because even though he had fairly reasonable concentration check, when you get hit with the lowest DC for concentration check is 10. And he rolled like a 1, and it was 1 damage from an allied party member using a rage ability on wild magic. And that dealt like 1 damage to everybody within 30 feet. And Lolor Skates lost concentration on a level 4, level 5 spell immediately after using it. So, like that's kind of like where I'm getting at is HKS would also have fairly high attack stats. And we entered the earlier part of the game where nothing could ever hit him. But then he could never hit anything either. So it was this massive like siege fight, and he's like running around trying to take over the siege weapons. The operators are swinging huge hammers at him. There's lizards chasing him, trying to stab him. Any hit could easily down him, especially if it crits. And there's like poison damage and everything associated with it. There's a bunch of deck saves that come out, and like a unit was able to grapple him and pull him away. and some other things, but nothing could actually hit him. But at the same time, he couldn't hit anything else. He runs across, grabs the siege weapon, and is performing base ranged attacks. I think it was like +8 or +10 against like a mini boss that was all the way across the map because it was a ballista that could attack him. But then he just keeps rolling like absolute garbage every single time, using haste to reload and then fire it. And every single roll, he would do absolutely nothing. And then we enter like an SS in our second last game where they fought against two fairly powerful enemies they had fighting each other. HK has failed every single roll and every single save on a different character. But in other cases, he like continually rolls 20s in the most weirdest of places. And it's like at that point, between these two games, whatever attributes he has doesn't actually make much of a difference at all. Because for him, he never seems to ever get middling rolls. It's either absolute horseshit, where he will burn through advantages, he'll burn through Indomitable, he'll burn through all these rerolls, and he'll just always consistently roll absolute trash. Or random checks or whatever will just roll 20 out of nowhere. There is really no middle ground for him. It's just one extreme to the other constantly. Lollerskays and Schwa also plagued by this. We have this running meme where someone in the game has to be the dice vampire. Usually it's an NPC. In Autumn Wind, it was Vincent, who was like this hardy Viking kind of guy. And I posted some screenshots in your server a while ago, but I posted it elsewhere of how he just would roll crit over and over and over. There was one time I rolled like 420s in a row, I think, or maybe 5 or 6. And like this was just constant. Like there was a couple of times he missed, but it was very, very, very rare. And this was an NPC that when I first started the game, I figured they were just going to kill him because he was an enemy of theirs. And never did I imagine that they were actually going to swindle him onto their side until I realized at that stage, oh yeah, he just wants to fight and kill things and die an honorable death. They probably can convince him to fight for them. And they did. And he ends up just decimating shit, even in the end of the game, constantly killing everything he touches. Except for the Yellowveer fight where every time he approached her, he got instantly one-shotted. It was just like the dice were just at the stage where modifiers really didn't help a lot for those specific cases, where it was like the other players that relied a lot on modifiers. We had two people with danger sense, and neither of them had particularly high dex saves, but danger sense gave them an advantage on dex saves. And there was constant just like back-to-back high or back-to-back low number. It's just one of those cases where it's like, it felt like trying to metagame your stats in that game was absolutely pointless. You tried to metagame your build, but there were so few options within 5th edition that the builds tend to be very cheesy. It sounds like Lollerskates is trying to make a cheesy build for his character in this game we're going to play, where he like tries to swift cast, hold person, and then crit them. It's basically like devoting like a huge chunk of his resources to just getting one set of attacks off. But I mean, it could be really stupid, but it's kind of like
he's like bursting down or something, I guess.
But yeah, like in Pathfinder, I was being walked through building a character in Pathfinder for unfortunately a game that never started. But when it was like there was so many different things you could do, and the way that everything interacted was very different. I was making like a shapeshifter that had like 6 different forms, like a werewolf shapeshifter. And it was like a brawler, like a pugilist, and had, I can't remember what the level was, but there was some weird, bizarre interactions. And there was just like so many different ways you could build just this one character. Whereas, like I said, in a lot of cases with these games, you know, with cases like with HKS, where he has a bunch of reactions and some utility spells, but otherwise, most of the time, all he can really do is just like, I roll dice to attack. I fail to hit anything. Guess I'll wait for my next turn.
Yeah.
And like metagaming, the dice around that has always been like every single person that I play with, they try to make the strongest characters they can. Like that's just what you're going to do when you're playing a game, is you want to be strong. Now, maybe you roll for your stats like people do like this, and you end up with absolute garbage, but they're still going to try to build a strong character out of that. You know, they're still going to try to make the most of what they can. Even if you have like Steak, who plays a very passive character, like avoids even interacting with fights throughout the entirety of Schwa's game, it didn't matter because and it didn't matter that Lawler's case also wasn't able to do anything by extent of rolling terribly.
Yeah.
Because I rolled like god tier and killed everything. HKS had like a quarter of my health. He had like 10 health at level 4 or something, or level 3, and just like never got hit. And
well, you don't
the
need
whole
HP
metagaming
if you never get hit. So.
Like Roller Skates has a very like high power optimized character that sees absolutely zero success whatsoever.
Yeah.
I have a melee caster that is somehow killing everything. You have HKS who rolled even worse stats than his main character in SS and just never died. Except for that pit that I was talking about in that discussion that held us up forever because they couldn't get across it.
Right.
And it was like, I think that when you go into a game like this, you have to expect and give room for people to try to min-max their characters as much as possible. You just have to acknowledge two things. First, that it's dice, and it's not going to be possible to balance. Like, you can't balance around it no matter what people are doing. It's like, when I look at the challenge rating system, it is a goofy goddamn mess. It doesn't apply to real world in literally any way at all. It's at best used for like distributing experience, if you're still using experience, which I don't think any reasonable person would ever be using experience in D&D at this point. And beyond that, it's like, you need to have what options are available balanced with each other to the extent of what they're possibly capable of to facilitate that. So it's like, yes, you can try and make the strongest character, but then I don't have to bend over backwards to balance things out. Within SS, I have someone who's been dual wielding basically hand crossbows using marksman, just dealing massive amounts of physical damage. Now, as we enter higher levels, a lot of things do have physical resistance, but as ammunition, I give them that diffuse low function physical resistance and other like special bullets they can get. So I changed this interaction to something where you can get resources. You can have NPCs craft resources that help you defeat resistances. You get lots of targets that you can choose that are not resistant. They have special abilities they gave them that also do different stuff. Elemental damage, line traces. You know, some bullets actually completely change your attack. Some are explosive ammunition. Some are beam weapon bullets that deal line traces. You know, stuff like this. And you know, I use like resistances as a way of distributing the fight, where it's like, you know, each person can have targets that are better suited for them to deal with, and then they can coordinate based on that in ways you can destroy resistances too. Damaging armor, applying certain kinds of debuff, you know, certain stages of the fight, even environmental things. So I try to make it more about interacting with things directly as opposed to just you roll the numbers. And you know, there's a lot of cases where it's like enemies spawn things on the map you can deal with as opposed to having to fight them if you can't deal damage to them or can't get in range. There's other things you can do instead to interact and change the environment. And I mentioned before about things like moving projectiles and platforms and stuff like that also add another dynamic element to it. So, you know, when it comes to the metagaming stuff, it's hard to metagame around that. Like, some classes and stuff like that are going to be inadvertently better at some of these kinds of fights than others, but they can't really plan ahead for that at all. So I always, like, when I look at this kind of stuff, I look at the absolute maximum that people can do, and I design around that, because it's kind of like an arms race. Yes. Players are going to be competitive. It's in nature. Anybody who says otherwise just doesn't understand their own psychology. It's what's going to happen. People are playing to win one way or another. They may or may not get salty when they die. That's beside the point. People are still looking to see the end one way or another. People have a goal in mind for their characters. Even if that goal is to see them fail, that to them is maybe a success. You know, that's still competitive in a manner. That's just how it works. That's how it's always worked. And I look at the game less about how the numbers are. I hardly ever even look at numbers other than averages, and I hash out the averages without using any kind of calculator or anything. I just look at how the game actually played out. It's part of my review process when I go through sessions is, did people roll well? How did that influence the game? Did people roll terribly? How did that influence the game? And I go from that. I go from like, it's really like instinct, like gut instinct, rather than just looking at the hard values, because the hard values don't tell a very coherent story because you're going by dice. And when you look at the overarching thing and the instinct, then the metagaming process, like the worst part would be as if people are aware of something because of something outside the game or whatever. They talked about stuff in out of character. You know, then that's kind of an issue. Like, one of the things I do to curb that, at least in like the small scale, is when I give people resolutions for stuff that they figure out, like if they do history checks or if they investigate parts of the map, I send that to them in whispers. And then they have a role-playing opportunity to disseminate that information amongst the rest of the parties.
Yeah.
And this has some really funny things because we get Schwa, who like falls asleep and doesn't distribute a lot of information in many cases. And people don't know about stuff that they might have otherwise known about. And this can have really funny consequences. But if she chooses not to do that or forgets about it, then that's now the game from this point, right? Or maybe she may intentionally choose not to distribute certain information or whatever. And then, that gives role-playing opportunities and player dynamic opportunities, right? So it's led to funny things where she's interpreted things differently than I expected, and that resulted in funny things. Same for other people. So, then that way I'm not like saying something right out in the open that people can just like infer what they know based off of that. But now we have an actual like tangible physical object in the game world, which now becomes set in stone by actual in-character communication. And then, that's then what right?
Yes.
So
yeah, that's actually really cool. So, I mean, that was definitely going to be one of the things that I wanted to hash out for sure, is like figuring out how to make sure that the communication, basically make sure that the system itself allows for role-playing, like begets role-playing, because what it sounds like when you were describing all the min-maxing stuff is like, I'm sure that will still happen. People are still going to want to be competitive anyway, but like if the way that they be competitive is by role-playing better, for lack of a better term, I know that's like super vague as a statement, but if that's what they're doing instead of like number crunching, then that's going to lead to a healthier game anyway, because you won't have all of this like, well, we have to bypass the armor class system, we have to bypass the fucking dice rolls, we got to like it's just defeating itself basically at that point, and that's really stupid. So I definitely don't want that to be the situation. But the other thing that came to mind when you were talking about that, you mentioned even towards the end there, some people are going to be salty when they die, of course. How do you think, like, what are some basically like some rules of thumb for handling character death? Because I'm pretty solid at like dealing with the world building. I'm pretty solid about doling out the information in a way that keeps things interesting and has you like really feel like you're part of a good world. Like I'm solid on the fundamentals for like getting the adventure started. But I haven't had that much experience in long games. I've never had a character actually die. So I've only got like thoughts on how that might happen. Whereas presumably you've actually experienced both sides of that. So like how has that, like basically how's your experience been, and what would you say are like the good and bad ways of like sort of handling that? Any things to avoid and any things to, maybe lean more towards?
Well, I haven't had that many deaths in my games. I've probably been more lenient than I should have, but it's also been a lot of cases. Like the players are generally fairly smart. They usually can read the situation to the point that they can sort of understand what they need to do. But people have died. It's just usually in the cases where people die, they have some way of bringing them back. There have been some exceptions, however. At the end of Albion 2, Schwa died in the last fight. This actually is what led to Albion 3. So I turned that into the resolving of getting back her character to be something that led into another adventure. Actually had long-bearing consequences as a result of its design. State got himself killed in Autumn Wind, where there wasn't any easy way to revive him. That's actually what led to that massive siege fight as they were trying to get to his body before they couldn't anymore. And in that case, there was certainly a very real chance of permanent death for everybody. Actually, they got put into... If HKS had not gotten this massive string of just untouchable luck, they very likely would have all died there, and that actually would have been the end of the game. I was prepared to kill them there for sure, because they did not plan out the siege very well. They kind of walked into it when they were already low on resources, and they kind of like... One of the more interesting things about D&D to me is how people will reach these stages of indecision and then they'll kind of all like stand around and do nothing.
Okay.
One thing that you'll notice is that there are very few people who will actually really take initiative.
Yeah.
And they just kind of like become the de facto party leader as a result of that, because they're the only people who start moving their shit first. And this was actually going to be HCAS in nearly every single example. In the few cases where I'm playing, I end up becoming that as well. Like in Stakes game, I was lower key, giving them the players a chance to really stand out. But it still kind of like ultimately came down to me or HKS to push them forward a little bit. In Schwa's game, I just took them on a fucking wild ride, and it was just absolutely insane. But in other cases, like HKS with the least experience struggled a lot when he first started, with kind of everything. But once we threw in other characters, like I brought in Schwa for his next games and other stuff like that, he acclimated very quickly. It went well, and never did I imagine he would become basically the person guiding people around a lot. And with that said, we do have, let's see, we have Schwa, who has offline experience for some years, but they were lower role-playing games. We have Mucky and Thalraxel, who are very, very, very experienced. I do not know the extent of their experience. I know Mucky is many, many years, and I think Thalraxel maybe more yet. So they kind of have all this mix of experience, with HKS being the least, but Thalraxel will kind of... I don't know. Sometimes he kind of sidelines himself. Other times he doesn't. There can be some push and pull there. And what will happen is that there will be indecision about what to do. And I feel like a lot of that indecision comes as a result of some of the more experienced players kind of feeling that there are danger points for them and not really being sure how to approach them and not being really sure what to do. And HKS will kind of sense some of that too, but just, I guess, maybe in like different ways. I'm not really sure. But we have had a couple of near deaths and near wipes. Actually, we've had a lot of near wipes in SS. And we had a case where I think our first actual player death was when Mucky dueled an NPC, a friendly duel at the end of the day. Except this NPC is a cat man, and every single time people talk to you about furries, they'll specifically talk about cat boys and how cat boys are all basically assholes. And this guy is no exception. He pulls out basically like a divine weapon in the duel, and of course that landed into a crit, and it instantly killed her. It was instant overkill. There was no death saves, just instant death.
Okay.
But they have revives at this point. Schwa can revive people who died within a minute, and there may be longer term revives as well that she has access to. I'm not sure. Anyways, at this stage in the game, they kind of really depend on Schwa for that. So if Schwa's character was to die, they would be in a really bad situation. And I have thought about this a few times where, like, what if half the party dies, including Schwa? They don't have a means to revive them. They would have to rely on NPCs. And I was thinking, okay, so not really a lot of NPCs in this game world actually have the ability to straight up revive the dead. And also, there's a lot of really nasty things that if you die near them, they kind of start sucking up your soul, basically. And so there would be some kind of resolution for that as well.
Yeah, you'd have to hunt them down or something and extract it again to save them to some degree. Depending on
the circumstances. They've had to do this for NPCs. One of the NPCs got abducted by a giggling pink cat, and they had to basically draw him back in and then decurse him. And then that left him pretty much fucked up for the rest of the game up to those point. But they did get him back, but they had to fight a pretty nasty fight for that. So they've been systematically building a harem, collecting cats and other such things, but each and every single one of those is not dead. Actually reviving the dead is a very different process. So if a player character has to die, the way I figure what would happen is if Schwa couldn't revive them or if they didn't have other immediate solution, they're going to have to basically appeal to really heavy-handed like kind of contracts or bargains, which will be kind of like mini adventures unto themselves at that point.
Right.
So
you got to do something real, involved for a very aged and wizened NPC or something, right? That has the experience and the capabilities to do what they ask. But because it's so rare, you have to like put in the. This is another thing too. Is like, I imagine you don't want death to just be cheap. Like, oh yeah, I can fix it instantly, and then. No. It's supposed to be a significant moment. So otherwise, you're going to get like way more reckless behavior if there's not like some very, very expensive resource that gets expended or something that like involves something like really heavily involved. But the question becomes, if that's a legit thing that you go for, like, then you basically have at least one player not playing the game for.
Yeah. See, that's what I'm always conflicted about that, right? Is because, with other DMs that I've seen, it's like a lot of people will just... I've heard the stories that many players will just cycle characters. Like, oh, I'm dead. Guess I'll make a new character. and then I just pop in. And for one guy in his offline group, they had this happen so many times because they did so many silly, reckless things that the party actually just had amassed a massive surplus of wealth from all the items and money that the dead characters had basically just left behind with them. And this guy had just like machine gunned through characters. And this is like, it's really funny, but at the same time, these are issues where it's like, I mean, okay, I think that playing D&D in real life or doing it over voice chat or whatever is a completely different experience than doing it the way that we do it through text, where it's more paced out and more role play.
Yeah, you guys have really long sessions, like individual sessions that take like what, 6-7 hours sometimes.
Yeah, it's rare, but that has happened. Usually 5 hours is
Okay.
5.5 is usually my cutoff. But there has been some long ones. I mean, there was the guys I played with, or that I watched some of their games and I played with them once. Some Pathfinder guys, and they would go hard. They would go like 8 hours. So I guess they would like start in the day, maybe have like a couple breaks throughout the day. Some of my early test sessions with Schwa and HKS, I knew that they could do a long time. We would just take like, coffee break, lunch break, whatever part we're through, and then pick it up after.
Okay.
But yes, it is like some people with the DMs. There was a lot of cases with some of these games when I was still playing where you would have not player death, but people kind of like split up in the town and talk to different NPCs or whatever. And you could have entire sessions of just one or two people talking and like two or three other people doing nothing. And I never really was happy about that. Like, I didn't mind that as a player because to me, at least the context was interesting. Then, I didn't mind being there and reading. Although some people definitely type very slowly.
Yeah.
But when I'm running the game, I feel very time conscious about a lot of stuff, which is one of the reasons why I've designed combat the way I have, is because it's faster to resolve. And the way I run it is very fast. Really the slowest parts about combat for me is dealing with Roll20, trying to type out some descriptions, and then trying to go through my stat blocks, which I've had many different iterations of to try to condense them down and make them really easy, fast to read, and know where my information is. And sometimes, especially when we have a long time between sessions, there's a lot of like catching up, thinking, what can I do in this? What can I do with that? Like I mentioned before, we had the last fight in Autumn Wind was about 2.5 sessions. But when you realize that the amount of shit that I had to go through in that sessions, that's actually lightning fast. So we have 5 characters. We had the main boss in itself, which was enormous in scale in many different forms. We had all the shit that boss summons. Most of the little units it summoned have bigger stat blocks and more sophistication to them than gods do in normal D&D, because the DMG is just really lazy copy paste of shit. But then we have a whole bunch of allies that they accrued through the course of the game and other NPCs and stuff like that. Many of those have really massive stat blocks. Now, I ended up making a lot of those simplified for their party versions versus the ones that they would fight, because I don't really want to be rolling like 1,000 saves. So I end up making things more attacks than save based when it comes to allied party members. It's just faster to go through. But there's still just a lot. But at the same time, resolving it was very quick. But I'm always very conscious about this still, because every minute that I'm spending going through stuff is a minute that other people are sitting around waiting. So that's always in the back of my mind.
Sure, yeah.
So, like, when it came to Albion 3, where we were trying to get Schwa's dead character back, we have this game where it's like, okay, there's going to be a process for them to actually find her character again. And that's a process where you have this player sitting there doing nothing for possibly multiple sessions, however long it takes for them to find this character. And so at that time, I was thinking, okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give this player some psychosis roleplay, where they are reliving parts of their past that have been changed somewhat, because they're caught up in one of these cosmic horror things. And so we're going to go through that. So we transition to that partway through, and we let them play that out. And then I actually had a PvP situation. Unfortunately, they just obliterated her shit just instantly. But it was a PvP situation. It was actually one of the more interesting ideas I had. I haven't made anything. It's really like 1 in a million chance for me to set something like this up. But because her character is living in this psychosis thing, and the other player characters are kind of in more or less the real world, I had 2 different maps representing each player's perspective. And each different map had different kinds of units for representing what the players were. So the players would see like basically demons, and her character, all her allies and her were just like humans. They were like Templar, and then they're fighting demons.
Okay.
So they're all like, there's different representations for each and every single one.
That's
So
interesting. How did you even do that in Roll20? Did you just have to like?
I had to eyeball it. I eyeballed it. I flipped between maps and I was eyeballing it as
Oh,
I
I
went
see.
along.
Okay, so you're maintaining two separate maps at the same time. That's interesting. Okay.
Yeah, so I had one set of players on one map, one set of players on the other, or just her on the other map. And I don't think I flipped them back and forth. I can't remember. I think I left them as the same. I really debated on that too, because it was like, okay, how much upkeep is this going to be? Because it was something I never even attempted before. They ended it pretty quickly when they got a hold of her and destroyed the item that was basically controlling her. But there was actually the chance for people to die on that, because the thing that was on her like massively increased her damage and stats. So there was a chance of someone getting insta-gib by that. But I mean, within Autumn Wind, we had Stake roam, and he was trying to find a wizard that was scrying on them. Didn't really realize or really think to consider the wizard might have like hold person, because it's not really a spell I give often to NPCs. I don't usually give hard CC out too much. Sometimes paralysis for like one round or whatever, but not usually hold person. But this was an NPC that they had been warned about several times, that they also knew was working with these other lizards that were basically like undead mini bosses to an extent. Any one of them, they actually got nuked by one of them earlier in the game, who actually did do like a group stun on them and downed a whole bunch of them before his time to leave happened, where he basically only temporarily existed in that place. But he fully exists in this place, and they know there's a powerful wizard that is with all these guys, so they've been warned about this. So I had absolutely no problems at all dropping them on him. He got held person immediately. He never got a chance to do anything. It took them a long time to kill him because of how tanky his character was, but died he did. And at that stage, it was now down to the party trying to get his body back before whatever happened, because Schwa did have a strong, longer term revive in that one. It did punish. It reduces your stats by -4, which reduces at 1 per day. Okay. So they did get back Stake's character after barely clearing that fight. But he had to deal with nerf stats for a fair amount of time in the game. And but I have thought a lot of times about what happens if they permanently wipe. Like within Autumn Winds, they had, there was that fight. That was a really bad fight. Again, if the NPCs had actually managed to roll not garbage and downed HKS, the party was going to have a very difficult time. There was so many ballsy plays in that fight where I figured they would go back and play safe or maybe disengage when they saw how much shit was in this castle. Instead, they teleported deeper. And another player actually died in that fight too. At the very end of it, he died. He did get revived though, by Schwab. But they had people going down left and right. It was a massacre. And there was many times in that fight I thought, this is going to be the end of the game. There's probably like another 30, 40 sessions worth of content in the game potentially, and they're going to actually end it here off of something really stupid. And when they first got into that fight, because this had to be spread out across multiple sessions. It was when they first engaged it, and then the after session was when we actually resolved it. So they got into the fight, and then that was our time, and then we picked it up. When we got into that fight, there was a very I've talked before about player communication and how a lot of people don't really communicate that much. But there's usually some talk after the sessions, especially from Steak and Lolar Skates and so on. After this session, there was not really any talking, because I think people were super salty by Steak going out and getting himself killed, and I think he had some regret about that. And also that they realized that this fight they're in is actually really bad. Really bad. Because even though they have some fairly reasonably strong NPCs with them, the fights are scaled to them having NPCs. These are 30, 40 monsters plus siege weapons plus mini bosses, one of which who again fucked them up earlier in the game. and the other one that they know at the very least has hold person and some other stuff, and they just killed one of their party members without any resistance. And then another one they didn't know too much about. But you can see that because I think people like kind of sense that that's probably going to be the worst situation that they could be in. And then that, like, when it comes to like dealing with assault and stuff like that, when it comes to these fights, like if people get themselves killed, like if they go out and seek death and I kill them, it's like I don't have any problem with that.
Right. Okay.
But when it's like, I think the issue is like when you have no control over what's going on. Like in
that
the game
duel
that
you
I
were
got,
talking about, right, with the divine weapon being pulled out. Was that like warned at all, or did that feel like it was just out of left field? Like, I don't know if you talked to the player afterwards, but
they did see that in a previous fight. He had a duel with another NPC, so they knew he had this.
And they knew he was maybe likely to pull it out in a duel specifically. Okay, so there's like mourning in that sense, right? There's like a little bit of okay, I got to be prepared to deal with that if I'm going to actually challenge this guy.
Yeah. But it was pretty close to, like, it was a fairly even fight too because he was low on spell slots and stuff like that. Yeah. So, and Maki's character is pretty strong, so it was. It was just he crit, so that's LMAO dice. But, it wasn't really much consequence for that because it was the end of the day. Schwa did have his spell slot left to do a revive on that.
Okay.
But, it just shows there is real danger in this. But in the cases, like a lot of cases where I died in games, like there was a one-shot that we played with a small game, level 1, and the party immediately split. Because one person just wanted to go off to the front of the train, and this other guy wanted to collect information. And I decided, well, I don't really want to charge off in the middle of nowhere, so I'm going to go with the guy that collects information. So the other player goes off to the start of the train, starts a fight, dies. We come back to the train after collecting some information and other stuff, and we get into a fight too. And I roll low on initiative, and I basically don't get a chance to do anything in that fight, and I just die, just for nothing. So basically, I went through like a 3, 4, 5 hour game, kind of like watching other people do stuff because I wasn't really in a position to really influence too much. And then just died at the end of it. And I was like, oh. So it was kind of like, it felt like a really big waste of time. I mean, it was funny, but I didn't really get a chance to do anything. And then when I died to the fire elemental, we actually cleared that fight. I was down or dead or something, and then I think another party member was down, but the other were alive. But this short adventure was based off of, I can't remember the name of it, but it was like an exhibition adventure where people run them in like a tournament setting to try to clear it. It's basically designed to kill you. The DM just decided to make it even more cheap than it originally was.
Oh, great.
And he just suddenly decided to, because a part of it is that you're running out of oxygen. But there wasn't really much indication of what our oxygen was at this point. But after the fight, the DM's like, oh, by the way, you ran out of oxygen and you're dead, lol.
Okay.
So it was really anticlimactic, especially when we worked really hard to actually clear this fight and a bunch of people went down in it. And then it was just like, oh, by the way, you actually did run. I mean, there was a fire elemental that's burning oxygen. You can kind of infer this. But there really wasn't any information at that stage indicating like this is the limits of the oxygen at this point, or finding this fight is going to drain or whatever. And like, it just kind of came out of nowhere. So that plus the audio retaliation, I was a little salty about that, but it was kind of like, whatever. But the other party members did not take well from that. There was a lot of arguing about that.
I can only imagine it's just like, really, it comes down to what is satisfying. And I remember one of the things that you said that I thought was a salient point and something that maybe hadn't been phrased to me that way before on the show was you actually said basically like tabletop play like D&D is like a mutually beneficial thing where the players like want a certain thing. Like they often want very different things than each other. Yeah. And the game master wants a certain thing like exploring a world or doing this thing that they're exploring, running the game. And like you have to kind of meet in the middle and say like, all right, well, how do I tailor what I'm doing to the audience that I have for the players? And then on the player side, it's like, okay, how do I like defer gratification or whatever so that I can, like with the idea that I can trust the game master to eventually give the thing, like provide the sandbox within which I can, claim the things that I want. I can do the things that I want and have the experience that I want. Like like basically you're creating something that's supposed to be like a satisfying challenge that will still at the end of the day lead them to the promised land of whatever they want to do, like whatever the thing that they're specifically interested in doing.
Yeah.
And that could range so massively. Like you even said, like maybe one of the players wants their character to fail specifically, like they actually want them to lose at some point or whatever. Like you could have something like that, which is like counterintuitive almost, but at the very least, if they fail in like a satisfying way, that's better than them like tripping their head on a rock, you know? Like, okay, well, great. So basically the oxygen thing is like like you said, it's anticlimactic. It's like you'd think there should probably be something a little bit more sane and less unfair, and more like, oh, the consequences of my actions have brought about this, instead of just LOL, you're dead. So
Well, the DM after the game, the DM was like, I mean, you guys ran out of oxygen before that, but I was letting you go on, and it was like, but we didn't.
Why?
You never read this to us. There was no read for it.
Right.
I mean, part of it's an experience thing too, right? So it's like, maybe the players didn't probe enough to know about oxygen. But the thing about when you get oxygen deprivation, you start to really feel it. So
it's
like,
pretty hard to mistake it for some other symptom. Yeah.
Yeah. It's something you should like, and like the solutions for some of the puzzles in it were kind of like, they were difficult to really determine too, because there was a part about a leak somewhere, and I was like, I think it was gas or something, and like this game is basically rules is written is intentionally very like vague at the best of times, and there's a lot of cases in it, like the final boss in it, I think has like a touch attack or something that just like drains like decades off of your years, and just like will basically instantly kill a lot of characters and you have to fight them like underwater or something. Like it's really silly. And some character classes apparently can just like they just divine and scry their way through, and they bypass every single thing that's happened in it. So it's
Great.
like it's not really like a standard adventure. But you have to keep in mind that you're not playing this in a tournament setting. This isn't like people watching people play through it and then coming up with their own solution.
Yeah.
It's not
a speed run or whatever.
It's a bunch of different independent groups of people, right? So it's not really like you can't really run it that way. And it just felt like, maybe some groups of people might really like that. Like, but it was very obvious it was not a hit for most of the people in this group. And it was like, I mean, these are people I watch them. They play many games where many of these characters die all the time. And, one of them would say it wasn't about the character death. I don't mind the character death. It was about, how it was sprung on us and stuff like that. So when it comes to like SS and stuff like that, where like over half the game is completely homebrewed and the rest of it's been errated in some sense, there's a lot of cases where I've been like, well, if players die here to something new, completely untested that I've introduced, how do I know that that was a fair death? How do I know that this was a fair fight? And conversely, if they win, how do I know that this fight was something that they actually had to work for, that they had to think around? Because I want every fight to be meaningful, even the most silliest and imbalanced of fights. They just recently insta-gibbed a bunch of low-level dwarves. They didn't even bother to do anything. They just like ran into the middle of them and just blew them up instantly. And it was just the goofiest shit ever. And it was like, how do I make these all mean something? And so that's like more what I think about. And again, like I don't really focus a lot on the numbers, which, in some cases has led to some stuff being easy, but in many cases, again, the players just play relatively intelligently. Like Stake usually plays the fights relatively intelligently and safely enough. It was just, in character for him to kind of wander off and try to, pull out this guy who knew was hiding in the shadows and maybe underestimate. So, it was like a role-playing experience on top of it, even if it kind of dragged them into a really dangerous situation. At the same time, it's like, if you die and it's a full wipe, you don't really get to see the ends or whatever you prepared. But as a DM, when you walk into this stuff, you do kind of just have to accept that a lot of work that you make is not really going to go anywhere.
Yes.
I made
absolutely.
all those extinguished maps for the Osaka place. I posted a lot of them on your server before.
Yeah.
And a lot of other maps that basically will never be used at all. There's entire fights, encounters, potentially like 100 plus pieces of music I've edited, a lot of other stuff that won't ever get seen or explored.
But you still had to do it just on the off chance they end up doing the thing, right? So that's like the biggest thing. I mean, that's like, what was it earlier? You were talking about like removing doors and stuff, and making sure that the only doors that were actually there were going to be there. And you were also, I think you were talking about, I don't remember all the details, but you were like, you gave me an example of some case where like the characters do the stupidest shit where they're just like drop kicking a wall in a church or something.
Oh yeah,
and it's like, okay,
fucking
well,
mucky.
Yeah, this is just how this is gonna work, and like now you've got to like on the spot come up with something. So it goes both ways, where it's like you have to do the preparation that may not ever turn into anything, and then you have to do the spot writing and the spot changes, and it's like, okay, well, I basically have to be in a superposition of like in the future and like in all possible futures, you know what I mean? Because you got to account for like you at least have to be able to on the spot figure out a solution that works. Like you said, like stuff's been errated or whatever. It's like, I think that's what that term even means, right? Is like you just come up with a solution off the cuff, or
you modify stuff. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. It's very beneficial to have your own world you've built for this. I couldn't do this in D&D. I couldn't run a normal D&D world if some hardline rules exchange came up about this or that. I would be kind of at a clue. You know, what do I do? I have to look up on the internet, like sometimes HKS does, to find official rulings. But even worse, if it comes to something that happens in the game world, it's like, it's just a lot of bullshit at the best times. Like the Feywild is all bullshit. All the elemental planes are all bullshit. Like any of this stuff related to the gods gets to be a real mess because they're all interpreted differently depending on when you look at. And like all the areas, like I had to do research to find an answer, but because in this world I've built everything before I even got into D&D, I had a massive foundation, and I can just grow it naturally from that point, and I can answer just about anything that happens. You know, if it's not written out in the rules, I at least can hash out in my head. So how would this interact? And then I can try to abstract it in the rules. So having all that on hand, just in my head, I just know how things can be handled, and I can get solutions easily. It's about abstracting it. So the way I see preparation is you give yourself a palette that can accommodate that kind of stuff as much as possible. And certainly in a lot of cases, you end up with situations where you just don't need to do stuff because it doesn't need to be abstracted in the rules at all. Like within Autumn Wind, during the end portion of it, they're traveling through this firmament hellish domain full of these nightmares. Those nightmares don't have any stats because in that state, if they touch you, you're dead anyways. You're just gone. And that would be permanent death. So they don't need to have stats to say you have this much int, you have this much strength. And a lot of the higher divine entities or major entities in that game, they don't actually have hard stats. They have stats that are equated to in dice instead, because their stats can't be abstracted as a stat anymore. There's something weirder. There's something more arcane. So they just turn into just chunks of dice or whatever, or chunks of flat mods plus dice, depending. It depends on what it is. Or sometimes they're abstracted in ways which the dice or the meaning of the dice are changed. So one of the I mentioned, I think in that tabletop discussion, that one of the bosses, the crit threat was exchanged as 3d12 as opposed to a 1d20. The 1d20, I don't think it could even crit off of that. It was the 3d12s. Each 12 was a crit. Okay. So the main might crit as well, and then the 12s are a multiplier or something. I'm not sure. I have it written down somewhere, but that was how I abstracted that. So there was a crit range, and that changed how their power budget was accumulated. So, you know, it's just, I can do all that. I can just do it on the fly because it just makes sense. I think that jumping into any kind of role-playing situation, trying to use third-party content is really difficult. And especially like as a player, you can at least encapsulate what it is you're trying to do and focus just on what your character has relationship to. And then you interrogate the DM, like, you know, what would this look like? What would that look like? How do I make this idea work? Like, I'm very much a communication-driven person. I'm willing to accommodate pretty much anything somebody wants to do. And if I can't accommodate it, I can try to come up with alternatives. And I'm about people communicating to me and being like, I need to know about this, I need to know about that. And I can just hash it up because it's too much for me to write on the fly. And in the same vein, to jump into something like the existing D&D world as a DM, I can't do that. There's just too much, and too much of it is scattered or paywalled, for example, to get into it, to be able to answer those questions.
Yeah.
Because, my worlds aren't super small and confined. They're large and winding, and people can kind of go anywhere and do whatever. Even if they're in a confined space. Like right now they're in like a dimensional maze that still covers all kinds of different potential histories, different times in history, different places. We have to have answers about how those ever came to exist to being captured in the maze to begin with, right? So I can do that in this. I could never do that in normal D&D. Never.
Well, that's the another thing is that like my idea for an initial, you could maybe say it'll be a one shot, maybe there will be a couple of sessions, a short adventure, whatever, is that you're essentially on this like collection ship, and it's operated and created by a species of automata that are not known for collecting prisoners or whatever. They're known for just disassembling everything into its raw materials, like a runaway paperclip machine, basically. And like that alone is like a very confined space, but it's supposed to be a really big vessel, right? And so like you're supposed to be able to go all these different places. Like maybe there's like dimensionality to it, where not only can you go like along its length, obviously you could go up and down. You could
lewd.
In theory, you could go you could go probably for like, I don't know. There'd probably be some way for you to like temporarily leave the place or something. Maybe some sort of projection mechanic. I haven't decided exactly what all the details will be, but. Like you'll see like a lot of different things just based on that alone, and it's like if you're gonna have a situation like that, you need to be prepared, kind of like from the get go to you need to have the whole level done basically.
Yeah,
because they can go anywhere, and just having to think in those terms means that you have to think in terms of scale, and I do feel like a lot of the default material does not think in terms of scale. Like, technically, there's lots of like, oh yeah, you can, here's how you can set up a giant town. Here's how you can do this. Here's how you can do that. And I remember like literally drawing maps, like physical maps, because I played a lot of stuff in person. I would draw a bunch of maps. I would have this like screen this big screen in front of me. I think this is kind of normal. It's like a DM screen. And then I would have like my own like materials and stuff in person and have my own maps. And then I would like have the other players, like I would have them, like one of them would be like the map drawing guy, and I would describe to him what was going on, and he would show me, and I'd be like, yeah, that's correct, or like, no, it's like a little bit different or whatever. And so like that was kind of interesting, because then you're forcing them to like actually draw a map. But if it's like a science fiction setting, it's a little bit more like, well, you probably have some sort of like, maybe your like suit has an automatic map tracker or something as you explore. I don't know, like something like that. And then like we have to think about like how to provide that kind of thing. And that would probably be more of like a technological solution for. I don't know exactly if like Roll20 or any of these sites actually does this, but like do you basically explore the fog and then like you have it like an RTS?
Yeah, okay. There's a very, very buggy primitive fog of war system that I have to manually clear for them.
Oh, okay.
There's a dynamic fog of war system they added, but configuring that is a massive pain in the ass, and it doesn't let you see allied vision. They've never introduced allied vision to my knowledge, so at least not maybe they did very recently, but not for years and years and years and years and years. So
I kind of feel like maybe that makes sense if you're in an area around, like if you're all sharing the same area, then it makes sense to have allied vision. But also maybe like if you guys go off into some fucking wilderness.
Yeah, in some cases maybe it should for that, but there's cases where like if somebody is off on their own, you want other people to be able to see what's going on.
Yeah.
And you can't do that at all. Right. So it's like, it definitely in some cases having individual vision.
Yeah, being able to toggle it, being like a feature that is actually implemented correctly.
Reddit doesn't do features though. Reddit does bugs.
Yeah.
So many bugs.
But I think about some of the stuff you were talking about where you're talking about scale, you're talking about preparation, you're talking about trying to make sure that like the characters can do stuff that like they can kind of go anywhere they want, or they can like, even if they're trapped in a confined space, like your maze example, there's still a lot of elements to that allow you to move around and allow you to do things. And if you don't, like in the average, like tape, like the boilerplate D&D game is like, you start in a dungeon and then you escape and you're in like this tower on a mountain and you have to like climb down and like go to a town or something. I don't know, like whatever. And that doesn't take me very long to explain. And like maybe you could have some interesting encounters along the way. Like when you leave the dungeon, you think, oh, finally we're free. And like maybe that takes like multiple sessions to get out of. And then you're like, well, you're on top of a mountain. Now you have to like deal with wolves and stuff that are like, that might be like.
Find your surgeon's glove.
There you go. What is that a reference to?
That is a reference to Van Darkholm, and fisting is $300.
Ah, okay. That's a wrong door, asshole.
Yeah, you gotta go to the dungeon because he's the dungeon master.
That makes sense now.
He helps people fulfill their deep, dark fantasies.
I guess he might put you on the tabletop, so it could still be counted, right? So I think about that stuff is like even within the more mundane areas, it's still possible to have something really easily like better than the default. But if the rules as written are all written for like these really small scale things where even if the map is big, the amount of actual content is small. Like it's not a very concentrated place. So
the thing with D&D and D&D maps, which is also something I do very different, and you might even get some commentary from Kian on this, is conventional D&D maps are basically all single file corridors. And they're like incredibly unrealistic maze-like corridors of single individual tile width, sometimes two. And each room has to have like loot randomly generated or just gold or whatever in it.
Yeah, otherwise there's no point in going there.
Yeah, the dungeon design for conventional D&D stuff, not just official stuff, but user-made stuff, is all universally really bad. And my maps are completely different from that. They're a lot of them are larger width. Like the problem with D&D is that they can be large scale, but in the sense that it's a lot of really small rooms and connecting corridors. But when it comes to like actual like scale, like size of width, you do have weapons and stuff with like 500-foot range that you will never see people even get to the disadvantage range on, like the longbow, in really any conventional D&D map, because most D&D maps are like 150, 200 feet at the absolute most of just hyper condensed maze-like rooms. That's what a lot of dungeons look like in it, and it just like you can't really envision anyone making structures like this because they don't make any sense.
That's what I was going to say. Is usually
this
silly. Triggers my autism anyway, because like even in games or whatever, I walk in and I'm like, oh, this fucking floor plan doesn't even work, bro.
Yeah.
like why would you have the whatever room next to this other whatever room? Like, it doesn't even make logistical sense that you would design it that way. And I know like a very small number of games, like Jonathan Blow's The Witness, has. Like he literally hired architects or something to like try to fucking make sure that everything made sense. And like that's a level that you don't even see, like you probably don't need to. You can probably waffle it with like a basic understanding that you can learn yourself instead of having to hire other people. That will
it just
still
needs
be,
to
like,
make
way
sense.
better.
Like just think about plumbing and airflow and how it was built and why it was built and so on.
Yeah. And also like, I mean, I don't know if it's like a shopping mall, you have to put yourself into the head of like a fucking marketer and be like, well, you gotta make sure that everything's on the bottom shelf is like the stuff we don't care about that much, and then the middle shelf is the best stuff. But like you can do stuff like that, right? You can like think, you can put yourself in those shoes and think, okay, this is how this person would think, this is why we would do this, and that's actually part of the process of world building anyway. Is like building out a world that feels lived in and feels real, for lack of a better term. It's just like you have to make sure that things make sense and are grounded within the world, right? And you don't get that in 99% of anything. So I guess it's no surprise that the D&D stuff is stupid. It's just like, I think I view it as such a missed opportunity, because you could have something that's genuinely like... One of the things that is attractive to me about tabletop role-playing is you are creating the story with somebody collaboratively instead of like it being a game. Now, even if games were by and large really good, which obviously they aren't, like they would still not be what tabletop can be. They couldn't be because of the nature of the medium, right? It has to be somewhat deterministic at the end of the day. It has to be somewhat linear at the end of the day. And like at the end of the day, there's just a very finite amount of possibilities. Whereas in a tabletop game where you have somebody actually arbitrating all of the interactions. You can do literally any interaction that is physically possible within the world, and that's clearly not the case in most other situations. Like the amount of time you play, you know, an RPG that's clearly aping from D&D, and yet like you can only pick off, like you loot a corpse and it's like, oh yeah, you don't get his entire armor suit and all of his equipment. You get like one rabbit's paw and one fucking like, okay, great. Like this is really useful. I get like
how about it's World of Warcraft where you're trying to get bear hearts and like 90% of bears never drop their heart?
Yeah. They're heartless, bro. I don't get that. Like, yeah, the wolf paw thing is like a real prank to me because I remember like one of the hunter quests for Night Elf in like the early game. I played this in like basically release. I don't even think Burning Crusade had come out yet. But I when I played like very briefly, I was trying to be a Night Elf hunter, and my character had to loot like 7 wolf paws or something as like the opening quest. And it's like, okay, I'll just go kill like 2 wolves and have 1 left over. Nope. Some of them don't drop any. And at best, they drop 1. And it's like, okay, I guess this is just here to waste my time. And it's like
all these wolves without their fucking feet.
Yeah, that's horrifying. That's like the
beaver stole them all.
Yeah. So I don't know, man. I just think about that and I think like this is a real sick joke. You know what I mean? Like, why would you not be able to? Like, if you can't loot a character in like the tabletop thing I'm designing, it would be because like maybe their suit of armor is like bonded to their skin and you don't have the equipment to remove it or something. Like that would kind of make sense. It also probably like the equipment would be so granular that it's unlikely you would even be able to use.
Well, and like, rules is written 5th edition. All armor is destroyed when you kill a unit.
What?
You can't conventionally loot their armor.
What the fuck? Is that to make it so you have to dole out like armor like a fucking adrenaline addiction?
I think it's because like, early units can have full plate mail, which normally costs like 1,500 gold and is hard to get at low levels.
Oh, so they're worried about you selling it, I guess. Well, it would be damaged and shit, so like I don't know, like instead of just destroying it, you might like make its durability.
See, but as far as I know, there's no actual rule set in mind for it's like, okay, well, I take the damaged armor and repair it. There's nothing that I have seen rules as written that actually accommodates this behavior and resolves how it would be done. So when you go to the rule set for this, already the DM has to make their own system to determine how you would actually repair this, what would be necessary. Can you do it, or do you have to hire an NPC to do it?
Yeah.
You know, what would the cost be? What resources? Like you have to just kind of just infer everything on your own. And you know, then you're well beyond it being deterministic or not, to the point that now the DM basically has to make the whole game anyways. Like the most offensive part about that is the fact they sell this shit and they sell it for such an exorbitant price, and it just really doesn't give you a lot to work with.
One of the things that I keep thinking about too is like, basically it feels like a lot of the systems within D&D by default just make things tedious. Like, instead of actually solving the problem, like, for example, if you wanted to loot, say that you wanted to loot the plate mail and it doesn't get fucking disintegrated when you kill the enemy, well, now it's, like, really heavy, and you just have to, like, carry it around, and, like, it weighs you down and, like, makes you have disadvantage.
Yes,
and,
but
like,
you see, this is the funny part about carrying capacity in D&D is I think it might actually be an optional rule. Because conventionally, 5th edition doesn't normally have carrying capacity.
So you just have it in a bottomless backpack or something? Like dimensional fucking
well,
portalers?
This is the thing that was never enforced. But backpacks do have space to them. But it is never enforced. Kind of like water. Water is also never enforced.
What, for your characters like hunger and thirst or something?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Now, rules is written with water in 5th edition, things get weird. Now, I think it was that in rules is written with water. I'm going to search it up here because it's really... I remember it being something like you have to drink like 5 gallons of water a day or something like that.
Okay.
Like, it's absolutely insane.
I guess that's because of all the exertion you're doing or something. I drink like 3 gallons a day, and that's 3.
I don't know. It's really insane. But from what I have seen, most people don't even bother enforcing it because I don't know. Like I think like with Autumn Wind, I faced this kind of situation where I wanted travel to be a big part of the game, and I had built a frostbite system as well because one for most of the game. Actually, you're traveling through areas that are so cold that you can't even survive for like an hour out in the open. But then I entered a lot of really kind of awkward circumstances where rules is written like you have prestidigitation, which can generate heat. It doesn't specify how much heat it can generate. It doesn't tell you. It doesn't tell you, is it like a couple degrees? Is it 20 Celsius? It's a cantrip that doesn't have damage associated with it, so it's probably you can't inflict
Like burning.
damage with heat.
Yeah.
But if you just heat up some rocks and put them in your clothing, you have defeated most cold weather. Right?
Yeah. So that's
because
what you
can
were
just
saying
keep
in the
casting
show
it.
too. It's like everything in D&D is just vague and not done. Like you basically have to house rule everything at the end of the day for all the systems. It's like you don't know the details behind any of this shit. Stupid.
Okay, maybe these water got changes. It says 1 gallon of water a day, or 2 if it's hot. But here's the interesting thing. This is one of the other silly parts about it. If a character only drinks half that much of water, they make a DC 15 Constitution save, or suffer 1 level of exhaustion. DC 15 con save is absolutely nothing, even a mid-range level. So there is a few other interesting things as well. I mentioned the oxygen one and the instant death. So the other part about that story that I forgot that I'm going to mention now is what leads to this insanity. Is rules is written when you run out of oxygen, you start making con saves. And it's not written in here, so it would have been on the adventure itself. The reason why he ruled the death to oxygen as he did is because he played this game offline with his real life players, and they also ran out of oxygen. But when you run out of oxygen, you just start making con saves every so often. They had con save proficiencies, I guess. So it took them over 2 hours in real life time to die after they had already technically run out of oxygen.
So what's the fucking point of the rule though?
Like I don't know, but like that's what I mean. Like the rules in some cases are very strange.
Okay.
I remember the water being sillier, but I don't know if this has changed or what it was, because they have changed a few things, but water is really just bizarre.
Yeah, I mean, your characters seem like they ought to be somewhat, what do you call it? Superhuman to some degree, where they're just impervious to thirst and hunger or whatever. Like, I don't know, there's a certain level where it's like, do you really want to get wrapped up? Some people would probably like that. Like, some people would probably like the roleplay aspect of, like, literally keeping track of every survival mechanic or something, but...
For On and Wind, originally, I wanted you to have to keep track of the weather and the coldness, because that was really the whole point of the game. And I had written a lot of that out. But then we went through the first stage of the game where they got past the cold swamp by using wolf pelts on their boots, which I don't think honestly would have helped that much at all. Then we reached the second part of the game where we were going to a cold area and we were traveling. But when we actually get to the point of the game where they're trying to keep warm or whatever, and I was thinking about prestidigitation. I even have like an hour, 2 hour, 3 hour long discussion in my videos about prestidigitation and heat specifically, because on one hand, it's a cantrip that probably wouldn't generate enough heat to deal with like negative 50 Celsius weather. On the other hand, it doesn't actually specify how warm it actually makes things. And it's magical heat, because you have the spell Bonfire, this cantrip that they added, that can be... It doesn't specify it needs oxygen. It doesn't specify it has to be placed in an open space. You can actually create a bonfire underwater inside of ice... and all this other shit, like rules is written, you can do that. There's something that says you can't.
This is actually reminding me of a fucking insane story somebody wrote, where they the DM was not interested in like errata or anything, no home brewing basically, and a player used this to his advantage by he had to like topple a castle door or gate, like a portcullis or whatever, or like maybe even it was just like the side of it. So he lined up an entire town, like array of townspeople, and had them all like he passed the first one a stick or like a log, and they all like in the same nanosecond because of the way that D&D works. They all like passed it to each other in this line, and it gained so much momentum and speed that it crashed through the wall and toppled it. And the DM was like, "Well, I guess this is allowed." And I was like, "What the like?" At the end of the story, at the end of all that, it's like, "What do you mean? You can't just allow like the rules of the laws of physics to be broken in your game because you're like totally fine with like how this works." Like that really shocked. Like the whole story is kind of funny, and then it's like, okay, but at the end he was like, "Yeah, it just does nothing because that's stupid." And he's like, "No, it works." I was like, "Okay, well, guess I don't understand anything."
Yeah, but anyway, so like I was thinking about the whole prestidigitation thing and the frostbite stuff, and I was like, well, at this stage in the game, like how much do I really actually want? Because it's one thing to write things down and then plan them out. It's another thing to actually execute them in real time. And like I said, I've always been conscious about how much time we're spending doing stuff or people are waiting or whatever. And like we can have the players either recasting this cantrip over and over and over and say, I just cast prestidigitation again.
Yeah.
Kind of like the light spell is like, if you need a light source, you cast a cantrip for light. And it's like, you can say you do this every minute or so, or however long it is, but it kind of like, it would be inferred that that's what you're doing. But with the frostbite and other stuff like that, it's like, I think on one hand, it would be good to track this stuff and add to the game. On the other hand, I didn't have like dozens of maps to represent all the in-between zone areas for if you stop to start a fire or try to warm yourself and then you encounter something. Because that was the whole point, is it was supposed to be very dangerous to travel around. But I realized looking at the game that I would just need dozens of maps to represent all the possible areas you could end up in as a result of doing this. I didn't have in-between maps for this. And there was an encounter earlier into the game where they were transitioning between two maps, which was going to take about an hour, and they were going to hit nightfall at that point. And that's when the Night Dwellers were going to come out. And I had to have a transitionary map because they were traveling from a border zone to the town. They would not reach the town and the light sources before they ran into these because of the time they had been out. So I had to, very luckily, since we were between sessions, make another map for that. But I couldn't do that at other points in the game where we were in the middle of making decisions. I didn't have the maps for this stuff. So as a result of this, it was kind of like, I just kind of like take the L, and I'm like, okay, so we're going to kind of like not necessarily waive these systems, but not consider them as big of an issue, because we don't really want to bog down the game tracking down a bunch of stuff. Like, you have to ask yourself, what is it meaningfully going to contribute to the game? Like, if I implemented weight tolerance into the game, but I haven't really been keeping track of your pack's actual volume. Because then I have to add in volume stats and size and width and dimensions to every single item in the game.
Yes, that sounds
and every
like
single player has to count for that, right? Yeah. So it's like some things you can tape onto your pack, other things you could just apply to a belt, other stuff like that. It's like, okay, well, we do enter this crazy situation where we have one character because his strength is so high that he's holding like 3 very large weapons. And even though these weapons have insanely high weight, some of them weighing like up to 300, there was a very large bow that they picked up that they had to bring to an underground area that weighed like 360 or something like that. And 2 of them had to drag it. But one of the other characters has like multiple huge weapons attached to them. And, I just make their weight really high so that it becomes an issue to carry them rather than focus really exclusively on the volume and stuff like that. Because then we enter like math for like accounting for volume and stuff that I can't even begin to do. I'm not a math person. I find numbers more like, if I have to get into crunching numbers, I feel like we've passed some part of the game where it's no longer even really worth like having in the game at that stage. Yeah. So I'm very loose about that kind of stuff. There's probably some stuff I've let slide that I probably shouldn't have. But in the long run, it's like you make the concession between getting the game moving on to what's actually interesting or getting really hung up on these smaller details. So when it comes to like tracking the environment and the stuff like that, On a Wind was kind of exploratory in that regard about what did it feel that was interesting actually making the environment threatening. Well, it wasn't that interesting keeping track of ambient frostbite because I realized while actually playing the game, it was too hard to actually track the warmth of shit. When a player goes into freezing water, then it's a lot more easy. But we've been ruling that you can use prestidigitation as a pressure washer in SS to dry yourself and your clothing off because you can create air with it. You can push air around. Probably not a lot, but we ruled that you can pressure wash blood off of plants with it. So why couldn't you use it to dry your clothing? It would probably take a while. So now we would have to measure out the time of how much it takes for you to actually get frostbite and suffer serious mental or physical problems from being cold and wet. And then we just say, I'll just take off my clothes. Now you're no longer wet. So now, like, like it was kind of like mentioning in that other one, in that we had things because of the different like item and object interactions and the way those have been ruled. And it's kind of this weird gray area where you can draw a weapon as part of an attack, but stowing weapon is an action. So it's when you want to swap in and out of weapons, you're better off just dropping it and throwing out another one. So we have Mucky's character to just have like a stack of guns and weapons lying next to her from having to swap them out because it's much more efficient to do that. But there was another way. I can't remember precisely what this interaction was. I believe it was in one of the short adventures I was playing way long time ago when I first started. I had a character that could use a bonus action to make a fire sword, and there was like some interaction that had to have me dropping my spellcasting focus to hold this weapon and then another weapon. And I could do that after I casted it while using an attack. Like, I can't remember. It was some years ago, but there was just like these weird interactions where because of the way your action economy was divided, you could do these really abstract things to get around the certain limitations that an individual action actually posed, because an item interaction or an object interaction were technically different than something like a bonus action. So it just like in some of these cases, like when I see these really bizarre things, I kind of just like go into the rules and just make some change somewhere that just eliminates the need to do this because it's so stupid. So one of them, like with the spell focuses in particular, you usually had to be holding them. I made Warcaster feat just make any weapon that you've held for up to 2 hours as be your spell focus or whatever, just to get around that. So you can have the feat that's kind of like emphasize this kind of behavior to begin with, because they already added like 100 gold enhancement or something. Then you make an item a spell focus well after the fact that I was doing this kind of stupid shit, just to not have to be holding onto a spell focus while I'm using a weapon or whatever. And I just find a way of just like trying to remove the necessity to do all these weird like juggling action economy. Again, I don't know much about Pathfinder, but I've never heard of really stupid interactions like that coming up. And it just feels like it really comes a lot in 5th edition, where you end up with a lot of things, and there's kind of like a divide between what really actually contributes to the meaningful experience of role-playing and what is just like busy work and upkeep for the sake of having it. And I think there's definitely a lot of arguments that can be made for stuff like tracking your water, tracking your volume, and stuff like that. But at the same time, right, like you're really catering your game to your specific set of players. Certain things that you would want to track would make sense for one set of players and not necessarily another. And also, like, I'm dealing a lot with like superhuman kind of stuff as well. And on a wins, it would have absolutely made sense to track this stuff to an extent, but I would have had to have done it at the beginning of the game. Like, the other thing I really focus on is consistency, right? Like, if I've set a precedent by not being really hard about tracking certain stuff in the game, specifically a smaller game, then it doesn't really make sense to thrust it upon you midway through the game and be something like, okay, we're going to start tracking all this extra shit. With Starsworn, which is a campaign that's going for like 6 years,
right,
it makes sense to do some changes as we go along. I try to space them out, so I introduced weight tolerance, and then I introduced some errata, and then as we start approaching certain spells, I'm starting to introduce errata for those. And the high function, low function system's been in there, and there's unexplored areas for that yet. There's other like little odds and ends they discover as they go along. It makes sense that we might make some changes to that, like as a result of Silvery Barbs, which was another new level 1 spell they added, which has no save associated applies disadvantage to anything an enemy does as a reaction, which is insanely strong. And in fact, it's not even a charm effect, so you can use it on anything. I made it a charm effect, and I may nerf it even more than that because it is a level 1. It was massively powerful, way too powerful for a level 1, and there was no point in even upcasting it. So, like, it was just so strong of a utility spell, right? But I didn't change it on a wind when it came out. It was just, this was enforced as is. The adventure is not really that long. I'll just keep it in mind, with SS.
Okay, yeah.
So
yeah, that's what I'm thinking too. Is we probably want to do a one shot or a short adventure before we do anything to test the kinks out of the new system, right? Like get everything worked out. And
well, you want to see how it works because I imagine you're going to have big sweeping changes, right? Because it's a new system.
Yeah.
A lot like CMBW, you'll walk in there with an idea, but maybe that idea doesn't play out the way you want it to, anyways. Yeah. Like it's really you can't know until you put it to the test.
Yeah, well, one of the things I was thinking about for the action economy was that you either prepare or you execute an action. So, like, this is a bit of an evolution since the stuff that I was talking about, where I was thinking you'd be
5th edition has something like that.
Yeah, I don't know the details, but for me, it's like I think of it like you don't have a like in order to like you can basically prepare a bunch of different things. So you would prepare to soften the blow of an incoming attack that you anticipate. You would prepare to, respond to somebody trying to escape by that would give you the attack of opportunity or whatever, instead of it being like a trait you have to take or whatever the case. I actually don't know how it works in 5th edition, but and then in the context of I was trying to think about how you would describe. I don't know. I just think of if you execute an attack, in real world terms, you wouldn't be able to also react to somebody else or defend and block in the same breath. You know what I mean? Maybe depending on your equipment, that might actually be covered. There might be some sort of passive initial block that automatically stays up or whatever. But the average person, if say you have a character with a sword and a shield, they can't. You can do maybe a less effective attack if you raise your shield and attack at the same time with your sword. But for the most part, you think about somebody swinging wildly to catch as much sweep damage as possible or something. You're not going to be able to do that and have your sword up because of the range of motion, physically how your body moves. So that example is a little bit more finicky, but you could imagine basically one of your executions could be okay, I'm going to attack tentatively, so I'm willing to deal less damage with this attack so that I can keep my shield up, versus I'm just gonna let my shield down and attack. And that can be the way that we resolve that, because I think that would also lead to more fair instances where if a character wants to defend against something, they can't do it passively unless they have some sort of equipment that handles that for them, like I was mentioning. By default, the rules as written would allow you to always either anticipate an attack or do an attack. And in either case, if you're up against an opponent who's the equivalent of a higher level, higher armor class unit or something, they wouldn't be able to just sit there and, block everything and also be doing something on the field, right? If they're a tank, maybe it makes sense for them to mostly be passive in that sense, or, do the mixed attack where you're also remaining defensive. So that's a current idea that I have anyway, is even more hardline than before. I also think this would make combat go by faster in general, because you don't have to account for bonus action and, whatever else. So I feel that would work, but maybe there are still maybe there's room for more complexity on the table that would actually add something.
Hi, I'm recording a podcast at the moment. I'll be ready in a little bit.
Absolutely owned.
No, you're a cat.
Got him. And just like that, I know exactly who that was.
That's an interesting idea. I think I know Pathfinder is very different in how it handles action economy, in that you can only do a full attack if you haven't moved, which felt a lot better than 5th edition. One of the things about 5th edition is you can move your full distance, however much it is, except for dashing, and then you get to do your full attack anyways on top of it. So it's kind of awkward in some cases. But I actually have a shield that they haven't discovered yet that's a really big shield, and you have to determine which direction you're facing with it when you use this ability. And then that grants benefits to you and anybody who's like directly behind you facing in that direction. So there's like I've definitely been trying to think of how I can introduce more like actual decision making into combat, and that is definitely a good way to do it. In 5th edition, ready to action is basically you use your action to prepare to do something, depending on whatever conditions you laid out for it. And if that doesn't come up, then you just do nothing. But you still have your. I think that uses your reaction, I believe. So if you use shield or something, I think that would cancel it out.
Okay.
Shield being a spell in this case.
So I think about that like. Yeah, I don't know. I was just thinking in my head, like, how would you make a system, right, where you can still anticipate things, or like, you know, and this would also like give the most sandbox for role playing too, because we don't have dice determining the efficacy of your action. It's like the universe has mechanics, and those mechanics work consistently, and you know, it's kind of similar actually. Like if you conceptualize dice rolls as similar to like upgrades in an RTS, if you remove them, like you get more consistent interactions at all times, and the only thing that will change that is actual, you know, buffs, debuffs, or intrinsic characteristics or something to that effect, right? Like passive effects.
What I would ask in regards to that is you're going to enter in a situation where it feels almost like rock, paper, scissors. Mm-hmm. But let's say you have your tank who's hiding behind his shield, and it goes to another person who's going to try to attack. They would know because you would probably tell them that now he's hiding behind his shields. So if they know what each other's actions are, how are you supposed to play around that?
Yeah,
other than just constantly doing the best decision.
I was hoping that what we would actually be able to do with a system like this is have simultaneous turns instead of bothering with, because I always felt.
But if you're writing out the resolutions for that,
go ahead.
Then it's not really simultaneous still, right? Because people are going to be intimately aware unless you resolve what they're going to do through whispers or something.
Oh, no.
And then
by simultaneous turns, I mean literally all players and NPCs would go at the same time. They would log their action,
that's what
and
I mean.
I would resolve it. So, like in the case of the tank with the shield and he's hiding behind it, if he isn't doing that at that time, he would log, I'm going to enter a defensive stance, basically.
Yeah, but how would he log that? Is that distributed to all the players or just to you, the DM?
I think they would discuss their actions, like in OOC chat probably, or whatever, or like at battle planning chat.
But then the players know, like his opponents would know that he's going to go behind his shield, and then they would change their action accordingly if they're fighting each other, right?
Oh, you're thinking of a PvP instances?
Yeah.
Yeah, in that case, they would have to tell me privately.
I mean, even you as a DM, that still puts you in a situation where you have an advantage of knowing what their actions are going to be. And you have to consciously decide to play against the interests of whatever goes on, right?
Yeah, I guess there could be. There's definitely the we were talking about metagaming at the beginning of this, right? So there definitely could be like an instance with that. I think because I know the consequences of all of the, like I know the universe intimately, and I know the characters and the NPCs intimately, I would probably be able to quickly decide what action they're going to do. I would think before the players even know what they're going to do themselves. And that's why there's like that whole discussion period.
Maybe what you could do is, since you're going to be building your own engine for this, as far as I know, you could have each token representing each unit have something you switch on them to determine what their action is that only you can see. So let's say you have Ahmed. And the player is Ahmed, and Ahmed's going to maybe scream Ahmed, or maybe he's going to shoot fire at you, or whatever he's going to do. While the players, or maybe even before the players delegate that, you decide what all the units next to Ahmed, all the enemy units, are going to do by changing, like, let's say an icon on them or something that only you can see that says, okay, this one's going to attack, this one's going to evade, this one's going to move, and all that's locked in. Now you have something that is agnostic to what the players are going to decide to do, and then the players log in their action, and then you resolve it. And then, right, you don't feel inclined to change it, or really what I would think would be the hardest thing for you to do is to be inclined to change it back. You feel like you should do a different choice to give them a chance to have success.
Right, if they accidentally walk themselves into a really shitty situation, right? Well, I actually am planning on some rules in general for for like character incapacitation, basically, instead of death, which will allow for like more. I mean, like there could still be overkill cases where you get insta-gibbed. Like that's, I know that's a rule in 3.5 is like the concept of insta-gibbing anyway, and probably
It is in 5th edition. Both of those exist in 5th edition.
Yeah.
Like I said, with overkill, where someone got overkilled in a duel, it is your maximum health over your current.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Plus unconscious. Otherwise, you have 3 death saves. If you take hits while you're on the ground, that's more death saves that are auto fails. By the way, it's very possible to miss people who are on the ground dying or unconscious. It's happened many times. In fact, one of the most powerful NPCs in the game failed to hit someone while they were on the ground dying. Twice, I believe. There's also non-lethal damage, I guess, for weapons, mostly melee weapons, where you can choose to do non-lethal damage when you hit them, and then it'll just knock them unconscious.
Yeah, so I actually don't know what the rules are going to be for becoming incapacitated, but there's also going to be a lot more granularity to it, right? Like, you know, I guess this probably does exist in 5th edition as well or whatever, but like if somebody sustains an injury specifically to their right arm and that's what they use their sword with, like then they are going to have a lot harder of a time being effective with their sword, right? Because they won't be able to actually like move their arm.
I don't know if there's any actual hard set rules for that in the game, but I have written them out for specific NPCs and stuff that can target them. So.
Right. I mean, well, the whole idea, since we don't have like difficulty of hitting a shot based on RNG or whatever, is it's going to instead be like, you know, how skilled with you are at this weapon, like the history stuff that I was talking about at the very beginning. And, you know, that I have yet to figure out exactly how I'm going to rule over. It's more like a, you know, are you capable of hitting this shot? Maybe it'll end up being somewhat binary if you like specifically try to hit like a very weak point or something. But anyway, like, I guess what I would say is, your idea of the players, well, maybe this isn't exactly what you were saying, but one thing that it made me think of anyway, and maybe this was what you were saying, is the players themselves could log their action privately, like without me being able to see what they're saying, and then they would send that action, and I would see all of the actions and then resolve them. So I would do mine privately as well. Like, obviously, like I'd know what they were all going to do. I feel like that could work out really well, even if it could lead into situations where, like I can't change the actions because they're locked in, but I can probably control the resolution of it to be not terrible for the party. If I would feel maybe a temptation to do that. And I think maybe in the early game I would even give in to that temptation because like the early stages of the game we don't really know how this stuff works and the players are also getting used to it, so probably better to be somewhat, you know, generous, you know, overly so with the like the outcomes of the game or whatever. But the other thing too would be useful for me is if, even though I can't see it in the moment, maybe after the battle is ended I can then review their like private log between themselves or whatever. Because then I can tell if like, oh, you guys had no idea what you were doing in this situation. like no, you guys had the complete wrong read or whatever. But yeah, either way, like there's going to be a lot of stuff like that. There's also going to be a lot of like, I'm sure the first couple of voyages in that sense will be really bumpy because I'll have to like figure out how to set up their individual journal and then their party journal. You know, that's one of the things that I had is listed in this document as knowledge bases, which get updated. Like basically it would get updated after every significant thing, which would include battle, assuming something was like learned as a new thing. And that would include, you know, quest progress, but it would also include like, you know, more granular things like, you know, your knowledge of the specific race's architecture or your knowledge of like whatever the case may be. So I would probably not list all of the very, very specific things and I would know them, but I wouldn't like clog up the log with that. Until like, unless it came up and like it was actually important, and then I would, you know, elaborate on it more. But yeah, that's its own sort of style anyway. But I do think that there's some potential, even if we have to jerry rig the system a little bit, so that like, you know, in the early stages before we have our own client, I have to like just not metagame the actions that they're doing. But I feel like that's
you could write it down in something.
Yeah. Oh yeah, they could have their own.
Just have like a different way of tracking it, right?
Yeah. They could always have their own, you know, chat or something that they privately do it anyway, so it wouldn't be impossible.
Well, I feel like when it comes to a fight, the players should be resolving their inner character actions in character.
Right.
Then that's going to be definitely a big challenge when you have simultaneous turns, right? Because then it becomes a little bit harder to do that because everybody has to make the decision at once.
Well, that is true, but it's like there would be a period of time where, yeah, so that's kind of interesting where they would have to like review what they can do. I mean, I wouldn't want to like it's turn based. I wouldn't want to like say, yeah, you have 30 seconds to make your choice or something. So I don't actually know how that would work. One of the things that I was thinking of is, maybe I would try to be somewhat enforcing the idea that your characters call out like what they want to do or what they're going to say or something like dialogue wise, right? And so they actually
that's something we've tried to enforce in our game. Is
instead of like maybe having to ask the DM questions in OOC or something, right? Is like that's definitely going to slow things down. Whereas, like
we
if
try
they say
to keep
like
everything in character as much as possible, right?
And so if they're trying to access their knowledge base, like that should probably be something they do before the fight instead of during it. Mm-hmm. And if they get surprised, then the fact that they have to like on point recall what they know is actually a good thing, and it means that you can't like. I mean, I guess they could still open when we have our client. They could still open up their knowledge base like as a document inside the client. So they could technically still do that. But like, I would like to stress pressure of don't take forever for your turn. Like especially since everybody goes at once. Like,
so something I was gonna mention, in regards to accessing your journal and stuff. It is important to be able to do that because just because you don't remember something in person doesn't necessarily mean your character doesn't remember it.
That's like an interesting meta conflict because like you might actually have forgotten it in real life because of oh shit, we're in a fight and I didn't expect that and oh man, adrenaline. And then
it's even more to the case that like a lot of time can pass in real life that doesn't pass in game. Like within SS, we've played for 6 years. In game, I don't think it's been even a month.
Oh, okay, right, yeah.
Like
you will definitely.
You can have cases where sessions are not back to back,
right?
Or they're not even week to week. They're not even month to month. Like stuff can happen.
Yeah.
And you may need to review stuff. So yeah, being able to access this stuff is important. But at the same time, you don't want turns to take that long. Every now and then before Thelraxel, it would take like up to 20 minutes a turn and we wonder what the hell is going on. But I think like stuff happens in his real life and he has to like silently go AFK or something like that. Or I think he also like physically documents a lot of stuff as well. So he sometimes like has to review that or something like that. But it's sometimes stuff comes up where people just have to go AFK too, right? So it's, sometimes there's just the time to catch up on stuff and read and whatever. So it's always nice to have that information on hand. More important is to make it as concise as possible.
Yep. Well, I think what I would do as a lo-fi solution is I would literally just create pages on the website, and that would be like per character and then the party, and then I'd have them have their own. And then, again, similar to what we were talking about with like giving the opportunity for people to hand out information, the ideal thing, and eventually this would actually be enforced. I mean, I guess enforced is so much as like, so what I was going to say is I wouldn't want players to just pass their link around to their other party members. I would want them to actually dole out the information in character.
Yeah, and hopefully you're playing for people that don't do stuff like that. like you really just want a player base that you can trust.
Right. Well, the other thing too is that like, if they end up spending a lot of time in character, they'll just get used to that, I think. And a lot of it is going to be an adaptation phase. Like, Kian's used to doing it over voice. He posted a video of, like, a VOD that he was running. And it was all just,
I gotta
like,
watch that still.
Yeah, it was all just people, like, talking in voice chat and doing their actions that way. And I did notice that, obviously, that meant that, like, a lot of the encounters ended up going somewhat fast. But man, if you're not good at spot writing or like you have to like shake off the rust, like I'm sure I'll have to, because I was pretty solid at that because of the familiarity I had with the setting and stuff. But like, in general, like if that's not good for you in text, like imagine trying to explain everything off the cuff, but confidently and sounding like you know exactly what you're talking about, even if it might be bullshit in voice. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Well, Schwa gave me some videos of, because of COVID, her real life group was playing over, I guess, Skype or something. And she gave me some videos of their sessions and I was watching those. and it's not really representative of what it would be like in person, but it's still really close because it's all done through voice and everything anyways. And, it was really, obviously really, really light on the, like, in character role playing and stuff like that, kind of what I expected. And yeah, resolutions do happen quite fast as well as a result of that. Because, for me, I try to just shotgun stuff as fast as possible. I don't even get the chance to really consider detailing. Actually, this last session is the first time I really took the time to describe something because it was such a major event. But in person, it's like you don't even really do that at all. Like, you're not really describing the buildings too much or whatever. Like, at least in this case, and conversations tend to be fairly. It's not like it's not like everybody's a voice actor. And even in my case, I have experienced voice acting. I have no experience voice acting when somebody else is watching me. Like, I don't think I could ever do it.
Performance.
Under the pressure. Yeah. It's very, 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 very different. It's very hard to do that. A live performance is not so easy. So, especially like I can do goofy voices. Sure. Not more serious stuff, right? It's much harder. So it's like definitely doing it in voice is very different. I didn't know that Kian was doing it through voice, so I think that'll be interesting to see. Spot writing is definitely very difficult.
What do you find the most difficult about spot writing?
Descriptions and vocabulary, actually. I've been able to do dialogue. Dialogue has always been very strong for me because of my practice with Apex and script writing, and then writing unit dialogue and stuff like that kind of prepared me a little bit for that. I've been able to do conversations and dialogue pretty well, but when it comes to descriptive writing, that's always been really weak. And usually I've needed to do passes, like when I was writing Throne of Armageddon and stuff like that. And even the little bit of light novel stuff for Apex, that little experiment. I had to go back to it, constantly revising the writing over and over and over again to make descriptions more concise and more meaningful and more accurate. And I find that repetition of words, limited vocabulary, and just like really struggling on how to describe stuff, and also like forgetting to describe certain things too, because there can be some fairly like sophisticated things going on, and then I just like forget to even write like half of what's even going on at all. And it's just like when we enter fights in particular, that time consciousness really hangs on me. So I end up resolving actual actions pretty quickly, like 1, 2, 3 sentences usually at the most. And only for really major stuff like crits or stuff like that might I go a little bit higher. Sometimes I may not even do too much at all, depending on what's going on. Like, well, when I was doing Autumn Winds fights, there was a lot of shit going on in real life, so it was just constantly like really fast resolutions, which was unfortunate because there's really major stuff going on, and they deserve to have had some time to take out to write them out, even if it meant that we go for another session as a result of that. But it's like, when it comes to resolving certain things, it's like, I just want to put this back in the hands of the players. How can I describe this to the point that it makes sense, but I can tell really what's going on? And I like get stuck halfway through, and I kind of like lose track of like, how am I going to describe what this actually looks like? And then I can't find the words to actually describe it. And then I just kind of like give up and concede that I can't do it. So then I don't. And I always feel like that's really struggling a lot. And like with Autumn Wind, I really wanted to try to work on that, but it didn't really happen. And I kind of just gave up on it as a body. And it's like, well, I just had to accept that I don't think I can actually break past this, because I just don't think it's even really like an experience thing. It's just, for some reason, I can't really bring out the words for stuff without spending a long time thinking on it.
Yeah, that can definitely get you, because you have to be able to sort of, I mean, the whole idea is it's spot writing, right? You're like off the cuff being able to do stuff. So
like even in these casts, I find it hard to describe stuff that I do or work on. Is you probably notice a big difference between these discussions and then maybe like Red Pill Roundup or some of the other videos where I can curate the stuff that I say, and I can condense it way more than this.
Well, the other thing, too, is that, like, part of the exploratory aspect of thinking is talking. Like talking basically forces you to take all of the like the stuff that isn't articulated that becomes actual thoughts and concepts, and like it forces you to actually codify them essentially and then make them real. So that's a big deal for sure. I think when you think about it in the context of what is the function of the spot writing, what is the function of the ability or whatever, it's like if you can get that through extreme preparation, and I know you do a lot more prep than like most DMs would with totally homebrew, maps and all of the like full understanding of this completely bespoke setting. And
I try to push the workload of what would be writing onto the assets. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so anal about getting the perfect portraits, the perfect profiles, perfect tokens. So if I can find something that fits my vision as close as possible, that's a hell of a lot less I have to write out.
Yeah, that's fair. Because like, again, if you just sort of account for your, what you view as like a limitation or whatever, it's like, oh, I can't do this thing. Well, if I can set it up so that I have to do that as little as possible, then, like you have to do some sort of sanity thing. Like you can't preemptively describe every single object in the game or whatever. It would take too long. But if you can at least have like a basic understanding, that would definitely help. So yeah, I think when I conceptualize trying to think about, like, really the thing for me is like I'm really anal about trying to start something without all of the right things. Like I still have that perfectionist kick where it's like, well, if I don't have the fully blown client and all of the assets already, why would I even run the game? And like, that's just so I can start testing the system, which is obviously more important because we need to know if it even works and to what degree it needs additional work on it. So yeah, I don't know. That's going to be its own thing. But I think I'm getting a lot closer to exactly running down the, like what specifically needs to be done for the whole system to work. I think it'll work out pretty well if I can successfully, nail down some of the more, important rules, figure out exactly like how to set up some of the stuff like the knowledge bases. Probably character sheets would be a website page as well for now, I guess. And then like just figuring out what needs to be done in that sense. And then the other thing too is that like I want to find some way of like encapsulating a race description. Like I know for like character creation in the first place. Actually, I don't actually know how characters were created for your campaigns. Like, did you have a particular system in mind for it? Did you just give them like from in my setting, there's no humans, so like you have to basically pick from like a list of custom races, basically. Like it's a totally unique setting. So in that context, I have to basically try to present information about like what their attributes are for like the combat and the other interactions and exploration. But I also want to make sure that like there's more interesting things about the races themselves that you can like pick up on and decide like, okay, well, based on what these people are and like what connections this might afford me in the broader setting, like this is actually what I'm going to be. And I think that's really like an interesting angle to go for, but I don't know exactly how best to present that information. So I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on like how you set it up on your end, if it's anything different than default.
Oh, well, I'll go onto my game match. I can check it.
Okay.
Basically, we are custom races. Most of the default races don't exist, but there were humans. Humans from different eras. That is the wrong game. But for all the custom races, they all have their own features. So races in 5th edition come with, I guess all the editions of D&D that I'm familiar with at least, they come with their own features, their own innate bonuses to stats and stuff like that. What I did for Autumn Wind was basically more restricted, where you had humans and then you had one of, I guess I probably don't have that written in here, but it was one of 2 kinds of beast races, and but it was mostly humans. So what I let you do in Autumn Winds is I let you, within reason, you could take the racial attributes of any other DMG PHB race in 5th edition, and just apply those to the human. The humans was basically just a skin you applied to them. So nobody really, I don't think anybody really took that, because the human bonuses are really the strongest in 5th edition for the most part, because you can have like +1 to all attributes or something like that, which is very good, and they're most flexible. In SS, when we started, I wrote out custom features for several demonkin races for the humans, and then the Starborn, which are basically similar to humans. And really, I just worked with people on their characters beyond that, because Thraxel's character is a primordial demonkin. Nothing was written out for those. Looks like a human, has different stuff associated with it. So we kind of just worked on that and hammered that out. So for me, it's like, I expect players to come into my game with a strong vision of what they want to make based on the information I've given them. I give a hook. I can't afford to write out a novel's worth of precursor setting and for all these races, but I do write out like what the race is, their basic description of them. I have images that represent them, and then I write out what their features are. So Fireborn would have resistance to fire, or some of them have caveats associated with them too, like they may have a vulnerability or an aversion to certain things that may not result in the vulnerability damage, but maybe something related to saves or certain types of weather or something like that. The Earthborn, that's what Schwa is using. They change how the spell components are handled, and they have a feature that can reduce damage dealt to them by half, I think once or twice a day, which again just supplanted from something else in the normal PHB. So there's not really a lot to making a race in those. I didn't really mess around with their attribute bonuses, because I felt like, since I'm really just about giving you customizations, to giving you the tools to customize, at the end of the day, I settled on you can just take whatever was originally written. If you wanted to take the +1 from all human stats and put it on another kind of race, then just go ahead, right? That's fine to me. So I'm pretty loose in that regard. The more complication comes with stuff like the background and the history, because with the history, it's a totally different world. Most people are not going to be as intimately involved with it as I am, but you have to be involved with it at some point throughout your character's history. That is where I expect people to engage me. So let's say for Anna Wins, I wrote out a basic hook for the game, which is the king, who is your old friend, has, you're a close trusted companion of his for some reason. That reason is what the players write out as a part of their history. So I give them a hook that gives them something to look into with the history, and then I wrote out for the world what the 3 kingdoms are, what their relationships are, the general technology level, their general political structure, other little odds and ends with them, their thematic, so to say. Not really a lot, but enough to give you an idea of what high class, low class life might look like for them, and their military structure. And then a little bit of history of the world, like their armies departed under a unified banner. The peace was finally declared after so many hundreds of years of war. So why were you left behind? Why were you not a part of the army? And why does the king trust you? So that gave me some good hooks. And of course, we ended up with a bunch of edgelords as a result of that. And okay. It was, it worked out quite well. Then Schwa wrote in, because one of the backgrounds is to have a squire. So Schwa took that, and normally the GM would control these NPCs, and they generally would not be really, they would just be like a sideline thing at the absolute most. I just said, Schwa, you've run a game before. Do you want to control your squire? And she said, sure. And it was it was a very fateful decision, because the squire was more like her main character than her main character was, because her main character was kind of like a stock grumpy old man, kind of a hard ass. Okay. And the squire was just a rampaging drunk, fucking drinking her way across the world. And it was just, every interaction with her squire was just incredibly silly. So it worked out really, really well. And it was like, that was just by giving them the tools to come up with that idea, which she came up with the idea that the squire was a part of a diplomatic mission and kind of like thrust on her character as a responsibility as a result of an altercation that happened in the past, that he kind of fucked up with, and so on and so forth. And then, we just ended up with a squire that he felt inclined to look after, even after all the kingdoms got destroyed. He just felt obligated to keep her safe amidst everything else. So that kind of gave her like a lot of opportunity to grow both the characters. And her squire ended up getting abducted by a closet and was gone for a number of sessions. And she was like actually legitimately worried about that because she put so much energy into the squire. So it was, and then there was another instance where the squire was dead and in trouble. And then they had to deal with her mother. And then she was worried about that too for the same reason. So it was like it just turns into really healthy role-playing interactions as a result of that. It just didn't really need a lot. It was just the way I do things is I just set up this stuff. I give you the rules that say, okay, if you choose this race, you can take the stat allocations from humans or whatever else if it fits. I think in Autumn Wind, I even let you take racial features from other races. If you can write out a justification that makes it fit, then we can do that.
Okay.
And Steak was like, okay, I want to be a warlock. How am I going to deal with deities and stuff like that? So we worked on that. And his deity was basically a dryad, and they actually meet her in the game, and then they talk, and she joins them on their adventure. And with Mucky's character, his character's head is cursed to be a barrel. So he has barrel head. And so now we have to come up like, how does this happen? So he writes out, well, he drank from a cursed whiskey keg or something like that. So, we factored that into there too. So, and then, how he can dunk people, and then how he knows the king. Oh, I'm his wrestling instructor. So, and I went into exile after this mishap, and I became cursed until I had to learn to live with it, and it became a part of my identity. And, they meet gods along the way, and the gods are like, we can dispel this curse. And he's like, nope, that's a part of my identity now. I don't want to get rid of it. So it's, it just
I don't know how I still to this day don't understand how you combine like the absolute pants on head retarded insanity that you have with actual serious character development. I don't know that I could pull that one off. That seems like a very unique skill set, is all I'll say.
There's definitely a balance for everything, but that's the kind of players I've got too. So I am very fortunate to have sets of players that can handle this kind of environment. I mean, because a lot of these people are like fans of like JoJo and stuff like that, and JoJo is very styled off of that kind of thing too. It has very serious like life and death undertones, and then you have like exploding cacti and cross dressing, and every like even the children have to be buff like fucking steroided bodybuilders. And like it's just really, really hilarious, but at the same time there is all the serious undertones for it and stuff like that. And it's like that kind of energy. Like I only recently was introduced to JoJo, but I entered it instantly, synced up with it because it's the same kind of energy that I bring through stuff. And it's absolutely like the university that they're in with an SS right now is just like the most insane thing I've ever put into a public project. It's very, very much like my Captain Planet RPG Adventures of old. It's just absolutely insane. And yet it's still like life or death around half the corners that they turn. People are getting down, and there's like serious shit going on in the background all the time. And then you've got fucking Luller Skates and Xavier.
Yeah.
And it's just, you have this mix, this absolute extremes of two ends, and balancing it is just, I find it really natural. It's all about your presentation. Like there's lines that you can cross in every step that would break that balance. But I'm always like cognizant of those lines. And I just naturally like walking around them because I just know how to balance this stuff. I don't know. To me, it's just not something I find very difficult.
Okay. Definitely interesting. I still think it's like one of those things where if we ever get brain download capabilities, that's one of the things I'd like an answer to. But yeah, it sounds like maybe you're also just very experienced in that field anyway. So it's something I wonder about because like when you're making your own universe, like depending on what kind of universe it is, what kind of setting it is, you might be inclined to say, hey, I don't want, my setting to be made a mockery of, right? Which is not what I'm saying is happening in your case. It sounds like you're skirting the line, because that's usually where I draw the line too. And this is when I'm like evaluating other media as well. It's like, if you're making a mockery of the thing, like, I guess that can work if it's not meant to be something that you ever take seriously. But that sort of goes beyond the pale. That crosses the line. You can't take something seriously if there's mockery involved, right? Because it's just by definition not going to work out that way. So,
well, even when it comes to casting, right? Like when I do casting for games and I'm playing something that's just like completely off the wall retarded, like the Alice Madness Returns Revenge run and the Darksiders revision run I was doing before everything happened last year, is these are reruns of the games and they're just living memes incarnate. Everything is broken all over the place. But I still tried to strike that balance between LMAO, this is goofy as all hell, and this is why it's goofy as all hell.
Right.
I think that casting kind of helped me prepare for actually vocalizing this stuff in the written word quite a bit. I probably wouldn't have been able to do it as fluently now as as if I wasn't doing casting for many years prior to getting into D&D. It does give me kind of that reflex that I can just bounce between stuff without really any even premeditation at all. And like trying to talk while you're playing a game is something that a lot of people tell me they really struggled with. And like the Swedishman tried to do some recordings for me, and it was like, I cannot talk while playing. It's not possible to do. Whereas I've just been steadily trying to work on that more and more and more. I've always been very aware of runs I've had where I wasn't very talkative at all, and I've tried my best to get around that. A lot of times I just won't record if I don't feel up to it. Well, there's a reason why I haven't done too much recording for a while now. But when I do record, I try to just vocalize what I'm thinking, and balancing that in the writing perspective is kind of very similar, where it's like, D&D is driven by the players. So we have some very silly people in our group that do like Tharaxol. Just how many puns can one man come up with? I don't know, but there doesn't seem to be a limit of it. And it just comes out everywhere. And HKS doesn't necessarily do really outward silly things, but every now and then he just does something that's just really comical. Like Schwa tried to stop his character from taking an item that might have been dangerous, and there was, I believe, a grapple contest involved in HKS. I believe it was in the defense for the grapple contest, and actually had some. Was it Dex? I don't know what it was, but I think it was from one of his proficiencies. Even though his stats are absolutely terrible, he had enough proficiency, and Schwa's a fucking noodle, and just couldn't stop it. He just like takes and just wordlessly runs off with this item. And just I think that was like a point that just kind of like broke Schwa and broke Schwa's character, and just mentally accepted they can't control the cat anymore, and it's just been absolute madness ever since. And
of course, he's a cat.
And Mucky is just. There's been rope, there's been paddling, there's been ear nibbling, there's been a lot of silly undertones all over the place. And it's just, it's just the people we've got are very much in sync with that kind of writing. It definitely helps to have a player base that is in sync with it. Like if I was to run a game for, let's say in a hypothetical sense, if I was to run a game for you and Kian and Veek and like, I don't know, like maybe like Jay Pr0nogo or something, we would have a very different game. I would probably be really moderate off the bat until I had a feel for what the players are in sync with, which is, you can't really, like, the thing is that when you get into role playing, even if someone's not experienced with it, and I think even more especially if they're not experienced with it, you can't gauge what kind of content they're really going to mesh with until you actually start meshing with it and really like getting results out of it.
Sure, yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. You have to make sure that you're not... Again, it comes back to that point you made on the show, which is, it's a collaboration between individuals. It's like both people want something out of it, or both groups of people want something out of it. So definitely feels like something that... I don't know. It's interesting because I've always thought that there could be similar to what like Vic was talking about too. With if there was like a client that helped with the creation of all this stuff, helped with like the management, I guess, of a lot of the very specific things, then you could easily see, you know, something that's like, I guess, accessible without being cancer, because obviously most things are just not using the word correctly. But like making it so that the barrier of entry is lower without. Like allowing you to basically focus on the stuff that's important, I guess. It's like when you make Brood War pathfinding better. It's like, yeah, it's just like you're not automating shit. You're just making the units not disobey you. I mean, technically, that's like that's automation from a standpoint where if you think that it's reasonable for units to just decide to fuck off, but like that's the
Those
sort of thing I'm
fucking
talking
architects.
About. Yeah.
Just stuck everywhere, spinning.
Yeah. Welcome to them being a ground unit, baby. But yeah, that's like the kind of thing where you would hope that people would sort of sync up with that mentality anyway, is like, you know, here's a system where you don't have to worry about dice rolls, like you don't have to have anxiety about RNG. And maybe people just are used to that, and some people even go for it. Like specifically, they like the whole idea of dice being the deciding factor. It's something that you referenced, which I can't personally imagine, but you know, they do seem to exist out there in the world. Yeah. So it's definitely something that's like, okay, I guess we have to, you know, factor that in. And those people would probably just, you know, they would need to adapt, or they would just not be for them, right? Because at the end of the day,
it's certainly a case where, like, if you were trying to come up with a medium that could substitute dice, but that satisfies the same thing that dice satisfy, that would be very, very challenging.
Is there a way that you could break down in your estimation, like what the dice do satisfy? Because I see a lot of the faults. I see a lot of the cases where, like, you can instantly off the cuff, you know, think of, you know, 50 different cases where in your campaigns or in the games you've played, they've just decided that I guess something stupid happens or something that you didn't want to happen happens. Like no party wanted this and it just happens and now we have to deal with it. Like for me, I think it's better if you have a game master who's capable and willing to, you know, set up the infrastructure such that like satisfying things occur. Like an actual, I guess that's why you would have to be a game designer more than a game master, or at least like equal parts, right? Because you need to design the framework to be actually good. You need to design the sandbox to be, you know, like versatile enough and have enough like possibilities. Something that always pisses me off about a lot of games, like actual video games, is, you know, they'll be like, oh, you can play this as a shooter or you can play this as a stealth game. And it's like, well, you can't design one of these games correctly. So why would you try to do both? Like, it doesn't even compute. And that's sort of how I feel about like most cases with, you know, even the tabletop games too, where like, okay, maybe they have like a higher hit rate for the basic stuff, but there will always be these like insane side tangent, like exceptions that completely throw all the rules out and be like, and you just end up looking at it like, okay, I guess I'll just never, like I can't allow this to exist. Like I can't, this character's OP or this spell is OP or whatever. And it's like, you know, if you play the game like that, then it's not as satisfying. Well, maybe it's like short-term satisfying for the person who's like twinking out, but for the most part, it's just stupid and feels like it trivializes every encounter, right? So like that's the kind of thing that like I just want to avoid entirely, and I also want to avoid all the stupid shit that dice tend to contribute. But I recognize that there's value in what they add. It's like we said earlier, we have to figure out how to replace them. So like do you have like a sort of referendum, I guess, like some sort of idea in your head about like what the positives that dice provide?
I think, well, it's more about the positives for what I believe to be positives for other people. I think a well-tailored, consistent system will always be better. It's just what dice do offer you. Number one would be it's easy to jump into.
Right.
You don't have to familiarize yourself with a lot of intimate interactions. This will be something you'd have to think about how you're going to replace this, how to make something have the potential depth of dice and all the potential resolutions while being comparatively as very simple, superficially very, very simple. And then three, well, also being, you know, as very simple. I had another word. There was the simplicity of it, the depth of it, and also something you can just jump right into, but that conveys itself very plainly as well. So the rules have to be they have to be very deep,
Yes.
but very, very easy to look at, very easy to just understand.
You don't want to be drowning in complexity just so that you can jump in and start playing around with the system.
Yeah.
And you don't want to be like, to our point about earlier about when we were talking about like satisfying resolutions to combat, be they victorious or defeats or whatever. You want to feel like if something happens and you couldn't have anticipated it because it's a new system or because of any reason, it's just not as, assuming it results in like some significant change that maybe you would not have wanted, or if you had been able to foresee, like that's a case where it will 100% be like, oh shit, this is not as satisfying as it could have been because I couldn't anticipate it whatsoever, right?
Yeah. The other thing would be the uncertainty. So from what I have seen, there is definitely a fairly large subset of people who like things to be just uncertain. And in most cases, in most examples that I have seen, it's for bad reasons. But with D&D in particular, I think a large draw with it is because you don't entirely really know what's going to happen. That low-level enemies could be dangerous because they rolled this or that. Again, there could most certainly be better ways to extrapolate this. And certainly better ways to execute it. But the way that I construe it is that there is certainly a draw where they can jump into something and it can be not necessarily set in stone. There isn't necessarily a fully given resolution. Even the lolly who gets all of her perfect stats or whatever won't necessarily win this fight against the goblin who for some reason can roll shit. And you can roll all that into the whole storytelling thing, which, the uncertainty of the dice gives you storytelling opportunities. And then in that sense as well, it's not just easy for the players to jump in and engage with it. It's also very easy for the DM to do it too, because when you think about it, when you have the dice governing a lot about how you decide outcomes in terms of role playing, it takes a large load off of your shoulders to have to decide those outcomes. And especially if it's something that you're not familiar with, like normal D&D writing, it's not very hard to construe that, if the orc rolled a 20 and hit you, you now can write out how the orc hit you with his axe. And the axe does damage because the axe went through your armor or whatever. Or if you rolled a 20 on some history for some cave or whatever, now you can maybe bullshit on the spot this. And if they didn't roll it, then you don't have to bullshit. Then it just goes undiscovered. So if you're really about that improvisation like I am, then it just gives you kind of like a kick in the ass to actually put the pieces together where you need to put them together. Now for me, it's easy because I just know stuff, but you don't have every answer. But the dice will say what you do need to know and what you don't need to know. So it just helps me organize my thoughts and then organize the direction of what information is going to be distributed. Whereas if the system for me was very static, I feel like I would have to work even harder on pre-preparation, particularly on information, where I would have to make absolutely sure that every possible facet was covered for ahead of time, which would be quite a mental load in the case of, where they are right now, they can explore a vast amount of things.
Yes, yeah.
And
that's sort of what I was thinking about too, is that if I'm going to even in this closed off, like tiny pocket of this vast universe, the cosmos of potential is still quite large, even in that area, right? They have all the questions they could ask me and all of the, exploration.
The questions they can ask themselves that you then have to resolve. Yes. What does each character actually know, right?
Yeah. Exactly. So, like, just that alone, like, it's a combinatorial explosion of things that you have to account for, and you will want to prep at least a little bit so that you, like, I have the luxury of having already made, similar to your Throne of Armageddon series, right? It's like, I have the luxury of being able to say, this is my setting, this is my universe, I know all the details. Anything that I don't have a concrete write-up for can be sort of spot written in a way that does jive with the rest of it, as long as I'm on my game, because I know that stuff. So like, it's my world in that respect. So I can benefit very great, heavily from that dynamic. But obviously, like you were saying, more broadly speaking, a lot of people are not going to have that. Like, a lot of people aren't going to be in that situation. So maybe it is just a very unique, bespoke thing, right? Which is,
some people are very good at spot writing and they can glide through that even if they're not really heavy into the actual setting for it. But I think they're a very small minority.
Yeah, well, we'll see where I slot in that at some point, I'm sure. I guess the other thing that that occurred to me while we were on the subject is I had this idea that there would be something, I don't know if I like this that much because it does feel a bit tropey, but I had this idea that maybe there would be something in particular unique about the player characters that would sort of like, maybe it wouldn't be uniform, like it's all the same thing. Like in Divinity, you're like some sort of god chosen pawn or something. And as like an example of something that unfortunately I've been playing again lately. So I have some immediate response to it, but like that feels very contrived. And it's like, oh, you're special and that's why you're like the champion or whatever. And like, okay, I guess, but it doesn't feel earned, right? It's not like you like proved yourself in some specific way to get this trait. So I would want that to be like, actually earned, maybe like in the adventure. And so one of the things that made me think about is maybe for the opening scene or a couple like quest line or whatever, you actually wouldn't know which one of the characters were NPCs and which one of them were player controlled. And that I think could be kind of an interesting dynamic to like test the stuff out and like as like a hook, I guess, because eventually it would become revealed that there's something.
You'd have to make sure all your actual like process of helping the players make their characters is done like individually in whispers or whatever.
Yeah.
In DMs.
Yeah. Right. Because otherwise it's like, oh, I know who, this person is, right? And that sort of thing. And like, it would require some buy-in, right? So that like the character doesn't just say, I'm real or whatever the fuck, So like you'd have to have some buy-in for the players. They'd have to recognize the value in it. But that could lead to some interesting cases. Like, I mean, I guess if a character dies, they'd probably assume it was an NPC because it's like too early for it to kill off a player, although that could be pretty funny if it wasn't. But like
Steak almost died very early into Autumn Wind too.
Yeah. So,
luckily he had a way to like fart himself out of existence.
Yeah. So there's like ways where stuff like that could be funny. I don't know. I just think of stuff like that, and I'm like, I would like to play around with a couple of different formats and maybe like experiment with a couple of different things. I feel like it could be interesting to play around with something like that because if you imagine a world where the players actually don't know their own identities as like their party members or whatever, it would allow for more natural role playing between the characters because you actually don't know if this person is going to, join you or even be open to joining you. Like something that I do think is kind of a missed opportunity or like a little bit lame in general is when the characters don't have to work to establish a bond with one another. They only have to do that for NPCs because they're in a party. So like, of course they're going to collaborate to some degree. And like you can have actual role playing happen where they're at odds with one another. They do some like brief PvP thing, like your example of like grappling over the object. And it's like, yeah, okay, well, you can have occasions where that like they butt heads and maybe even fight each other to some degree.
PvP in general is a really contested thing. Really contested.
Well, yeah, and it's because of the dice, I'm sure, at least in part, right? It's like,
well, no, it's the very concept. Like it's the very concept of player versus player, regardless of dice or anything related. I'm actually really surprised by this because this is part of my green text adventures. I ran into some hubbub about this. So when I started playing D&D, Labyrinth is like, he went out of his way to basically say, just keep in mind this is a game. Nobody's out to get you. If there's player character interactions, characters can say things. Characters might be even hostile to each other. It doesn't mean the people are out to get you. It's just a game. Keep in mind. And I'm like, yeah, well, of course, it's role playing. Like that's gonna happen.
Yes.
Right. Like that's just like to
this
me.
Sounds
that just
like
seemed
a
like
real
a no-brainer.
Grim opener to a story.
But there was an interaction considerably later on of this new player that got introduced.
Okay.
And she had her boyfriend character in there, and he's also a mystic. So they're like communicating telepathically with like there's like like a murder scene kind of thing that my player character was like kind of like investigating and had reasons to suspect that people like knew things. Like I know things that a character my player character doesn't know.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of just like tiptoeing around that. And you got two dudes sitting in this room just not saying anything, just kind of like staring at each other or whatever, and then they leave. And then like my player character is kind of like suspicious. So I asked the DM like, do I see or sense anything off about them? Like, or do I think they're hiding something, that they know something was going on? And that led to some insight and deception, and they failed it. And so, like, I know that they're hiding something, but I don't know anything. So then that resolves. There was nothing else happened. They left, and whatever happens. I said after the game that I had entertained the thought of trying to hold them up over that and trying to get information out of them. And that did not go well with the new player. This was someone who still had years of experience playing D&D, but apparently had never encountered the thought that another player character might try to confront her over something.
Interesting.
After exchanging many stories about us in regards to the Pathfinder games, where she would be like, "Oh, if the player characters in the other group fought me, they would be so fucked because I have this combination of spells that gives me like retaliation damage that's insane, and I'm also the party healer and shit." So it's like knew about PvP, but never for some reason thought that
it would happen.
Come up here.
Yeah, I got it.
And then went as far as saying stuff like, "Oh, the dice don't mean anything. Just because we failed deception, you rolled insight higher doesn't mean you know anything." And it's like, but that's literally what the rules are. That's why the dice exists. Yeah. So like that, like this was like, and there was a lot of assaults over that. And it kind of like brought me back to what Labyrinth said, where I thought, that's absolutely absurd. Why are you even telling me about this? Of course, like, it's role playing. It's just you're playing a game. You're impersonating characters. I mean, we shit talk each other in Warcraft 3 all the time, and like Labyrinth has been a part of that. He knows that. Yep. So but he must have a reason, and this is why he has a reason to say that, is because there are people. The root of the issue is that this player perceives that all player characters and all players always are working together, that they're never going to really do anything to like undermine each other or like the whole idea of PvP is kind of like this off limits thing, which it wasn't even like I was intending to just go out and get all these people because I thought they were hiding something. It was more like my character was frustrated. My character was also a pirate, by the way, so it kind of like even fits with the character theme. I wasn't just musing this out of the blue. There was a reason why.
Yeah.
But they construed that as like a personal attack that I didn't even do anything in game.
Yeah, you
I
just said,
intentionally didn't do anything because I didn't want to.
Something.
I didn't want to get. Yeah, I was just like offhandedly mentioned it, and they just like exploded over this, and it was like that was really like that was like a footnote to the green text adventures I've had, but it was certainly one of those instances where it made me realize that the very subject of PvP is just like I think for most people, like again, I'm blessed with my player base right now where it's like they're all mature and level-headed enough to deal with anything that really comes up. But it's a case where like you do have to be aware of the players you do have, because there is definitely people who will have really, really different opinions on this. And like, I mean, I don't think it's even necessarily like an age or an experience thing. I think it's just like that's how they were brought up.
It's a personality thing. I remember having an interesting observation where I would go through, like, I think it was Role Player Guild or Role Playing Guild or something. It's like some website where you do play by post, and it was all like, here's people just like doing like writing very public autism, basically, where they're like, here's my insane character. And like, I remember when I was actually posting on there, like when I was a wee lad, thankfully all the fucking posts got deleted when they updated the site, because Jesus Christ, that would be embarrassing. But
listen, like, archive.org.
Yeah, maybe it's still out there. But there was like this, I remember this distinct stupid
The truth
one.
is out there.
Yeah, there was this distinctly stupid interaction where I wrote a character who's going to be like 700 years old because I was an edgelord, and I thought that would be epic.
At least it's not 300.
And well, listen,
it's close.
After I wrote that, I made this big deal about like, oh my God, I can't believe I fucking typoed. Imagine only being 700. I meant 1,700 years. I was like really fucking like I was like beating myself up over typoing, and I was like making this big deal.
God
like,
bless.
That would be so embarrassing. Like it was just tism, right? But like something that would come up on these forums would be like, if you role played, and then you were supposed to like, there's like a whole section called Arena, and you would like create a character specifically to like fight other characters in role playing. And like it was just mountains of salt because like nobody wants to lose. And everybody's thinking like, yeah, man, I'm gonna be the chief bitch around here, dude. I'm gonna kill everybody. And then like somebody's just like, oh, well, actually, I stab you in the face and you're dead. And it's like, yeah, okay, that's probably how most of them ended. I actually don't like. Maybe I'm disparaging them overly, but like I just remember reading about that and like everybody getting so angry about like resolution. Like, how do you come to an agreement on a resolution when you're expressly having conflict? And at least with a game master, that makes a bit more sense because they can arbitrate that. But
that's what dice help you do too, right? Is they tell you outright what happened. Like like the DM is gonna resolve it. But the rule, at least the dice, like if you rolled a 1 and you crit, maybe you don't do any damage because of the weapon type in the end, but you hit. And it's just like you can't argue about that because it's literally what the dice said. So that's why having actual written rules as groundwork is so important so you don't end up in that situation.
Yep, absolutely. And the other thing too is that like you want to make sure that you have some grounding for what the actual setup is going to look like overall. Like if the players can at least like imagine what's going to happen or envision a potential future, and then beyond that they can like actually put it into practice. Like one of the things that's going to be part of the setting, a deep part of the setting, is that you are going to need to explore how some of the things work, how the races operate, what their logistics are, and then we can get into like, okay, I've discovered like this particular race's like tendencies, but then I found another member of that race that they act like very differently and they're part of a different faction, and it's like, is that the defining characteristic? And then like eventually you start learning about like down to the individual level, but you like start with really broad strokes so that you can start to comprehend how things work. And I think that ends up being really interesting as a way to explore a setting, but it's also something that like if you're not actually interested in doing the exploratory stuff, if you're only particularly interested in like combat and dice rolls or whatever, then like it's definitely like one of the things you mentioned is like if you struggle with role playing, then this setting or this system is not really going to work out too well, right? And some people do play tabletop role playing games for reasons other than role playing, and or that's just like a weak part of their system. So like they're not super good at that specific thing, and I think that's like a big deal in general, is like trying to figure out how to sort of marry those two.
Well, I think giving them a ladder is important, right? Like the reason why I did my one shots and stuff like that, my early test sessions for the characters, is to get people into the characters so that I understood how they play and stuff like that. Like when I first got into D&D and I played these games and I had issues like with this PvP discussion, it was like I come from a development background. I come from a writing background. Like to me, like I just thought these people were joking. Like I thought it was a joke that they were just acting upset or whatever. I was really confused by the whole thing for the longest time. But then like after the fact that it was kind of explained to me by someone else and I kind of like understood that. And I was like, okay. So the interaction still is confusing to me, but I understand the underlying reasons why. And that's the case for a lot of things where it's like, I come from a background where it's like you just kind of like make mistakes, you kind of like fuck things up, and then you just keep going and just learn from shit that happens or whatever. And like most of us are not really great writers. I think that like Thoraxel is very, very experienced. Kind of like I get him. I always imagine it's kind of like a laid back figure, and he kind of will write out wordy stuff and then kind of like let other people do their stuff. And then Mucky is he just will come out of nowhere with this. Like Mucky and Schwab were just like, their characters are just fucking with each other every single morning. They would like set each other on fire. People were getting shot. Like high level spell slots were being burned for the sake of mischief, like almost every single day, where sometimes people end up with like a quarter of their health left from them just like playing pranks on each other and doing stupid shit constantly. And it was just like, this just kind of like came out of nowhere, and it just kept going for a long time until they started getting into really dangerous constant situations where they really couldn't afford to be doing that. But I imagine that once the game starts slowing down, it's going to happen again. And it's gonna just keep continuing. Like there was really just elaborate shit going on, and it's like I never would have meant like I'm talking about this PvP stuff. And someone getting like mega salty just because I said I was considering just like holding them hostage and trying to get information out of them. Now we literally had Maki like shooting at Schwa using ricochet shots. Not the only reason Schwa didn't get hit by this is because I rolled a resolution of what the bullet hit. It either hit Schwa's character or hit the character's notepad, and it just disintegrated the notepad completely outright. But then we had other things of people being held, being set on fire, again, people getting shot at left and right. And like an explosive bullet, like actual like valuable limited ammunition was used to shoot Schwa in the middle of a room. Like the literal actual PvP situation is just going on, and it's just like knee slapping and laughter, and it was just all incredibly silly. And it was just like I never would have imagined we ended up in these situations just constantly, you know, as a result of just shenanigans, right? Like that's just what you kind of end up in, and you know, like that's just how comfortable people are with each other, and that's you know, you need to like the part of the exploratory process for you, I think, will be not just like I think you're going to need to find a subset of players that you can stick consistently with, and you're not just going to be exploring like what works with the game, but also really what works with the players. Because I imagine that every single like if you had our sample size, every single one of us is going to be completely different.
Sure, yeah. Well, yeah, that's another big thing for sure is like trying to figure out how to present it to the players, and then how to like get a good read. That's why I want to do something short for sure. That's another reason, similar to what you were saying, is like do these short test sessions and see what people like, and if they and they can see what they like too. Like maybe they don't know if they're kind of new to it or inexperienced, and you know if you're doing a new system like this, they can see what they like about that new system as well, and that's going to be a big deal. And I think, I mean, like on the one hand, it kind of it's like maybe this setting that I have in mind for like the collection ship that's not really supposed to be a collection ship because this race doesn't normally collect things is like a pretty novel idea even within the concept itself, and even with within the setting. And I almost feel like I would be partially like I might be wasting it in some ways if it's like the first thing we do, but at the same time it's like a perfect like initial point of figuring out like everything, because you know I was thinking like it probably makes sense to do something that's akin to dungeon crawling, because that is where you get this constrained environment where there's like a preset number of things that you can explore. I can come up with all
it's also relatable, right?
And yeah, well, everybody's doing the same thing in some
everyone kind of understands the process at this stage, so
even if you've never played D&D before, you know you've played a game that is involved you waking up in a dungeon, you know, like or whatever. Like you're familiar
covered
with the
in
premise.
slap marks.
Yeah, like what the fuck happened, man? And why am I wearing a tail? Imagine you check your inventory, and that's all you see.
Use surgeon mint.
You left that in your backpack.
Yeah,
I think. There's a lot of interesting angles that can be done for a conversation about this stuff too, which is why I definitely think we need to do that, do more episodes of that show, because just getting people's opinions on like character progression is going to be a big deal. Getting people's opinions on like, I know you were talking about like you have these crafting systems you're not like even some of which are not even exposed to the players yet, and like they have to discover. I know that something that I definitely want is like, I want to avoid some of the more tedious aspects of games that end up being like try to be made like D&D, where I'm just going to loot everything, be a loot vacuum like you were describing earlier, and then I'm just going to sell all this stuff for money and turn it in for like better stuff. And it's like
I don't have currency in any of my games.
Yeah, that might be a good way to think about it too. It's like maybe instead you have like social capital or something, and so you can get people to do things for you.
Basically,
yeah. That might
it's
be
like
a better
China.
way to do it, because then it's more about what you've done for these people and less about, or what you can offer these people, and less about like, you know, like a simple example might be like maybe you're somebody who knows how to use healing or knows how to like treat wounds, and you find a guy who's like, you know, slowly dying of an infected wound or something, and you can heal him. It's like, okay, well, this guy's got to be indebted to you to some degree, right? So like that could be like a simple way of like they can choose to do that, or they can like ask questions about who he is. Like maybe they find out he's actually like deserves his fate or whatever, and that's like a simple way for role playing to happen. But even though you can in theory resolve that interaction very quickly, it can then lead to many other things, and that's also just a very simple blasé example that like you can imagine something very different where you could like if every single NPC has something to offer to the world and to the party, assuming certain conditions are met, and some of which may be very like elaborate and not communicated plainly, then you just get a much more rich environment with which to explore and to get stuck into. I think like I'm sure you found this out with like certain types of NPCs that your players will gravitate towards, right? It's like there's going to be certain ones that they actually try to, maybe they try to swoon over to their side. Like you're talking about that Viking guy, Vincent. It's like, yeah, if they can like tap into what this person wants, and if this person is willing to like be somewhat, jovial and compatriotic or whatever, it's like, okay, yeah, sure. There can be some conviviality there. They can work together and for who knows how long, right? Like maybe they're only going to stick around for a little bit before they like move on, or, maybe they die in a battle or something. Like the fact, like that's really tapping into like some of the essence of what makes tabletop play interesting and exciting is like you literally have an infinite possibilities. Like it's not a deterministic linear state. Like the systems themselves in our case might be more on the static side, but that's just like consistent tool sets, and you decide which action to leverage in any capacity. Like you have so much more freedom than in an actual digital game. So that's where I think it ends up being just way more interesting. It has the capacity to be way more interesting, and obviously something very different as well. Like if you just want to play a game, then that's a bit different. But if you're really looking for the role-playing experience, like I think we just need a system that stresses that and provides more opportunity for that. Because I'm not satisfied at all with like the state of like the average game that I'm aware of. Like maybe in the other thing that could happen by us talking about this on this show and talking about this on Roundtabletop Talk is like maybe we just find out that actually somebody's already done something that removes dice successfully, and like we can discover that. But
there's a lot of different systems, and I've never even scratched the surface of them. So
yeah. It could very well be the case. I don't know if any of them will be significant or useful or whatever. I was actually just looking up like alternatives to Roll20 basically, and I'm not.
There is Foundry, which is
Foundry seems like it's interesting because the DM or game master or whatever pays for a license themselves. It seems like it's like 50 USD or something.
Yeah,
and then
we were gonna consider testing that, but it's the process of transferring the data between the players
that's gonna be a problem.
Like it could be quite heavy on bandwidth to do it smoothly, and like there was just some unknowns about it as well.
Yeah.
But we were going to try it at some point, I think, but we never really got around to it for a variety of reasons. Because it's like, well, HKS is trying to work on this client, and my internet was supposed to be better here, but is not because of reasons we don't really understand. Like there's uncertainties, but we might get back to that. But
maybe that would be better for starting something new anyway. But I think you said you
code
were really
plugins and stuff like that. So
yeah,
but yeah, it's I don't know. Like it's one of those things. It's like, but like beyond Foundry, I don't know of any real alternatives. There's map tools, but it's very, very limited.
There's something called Tailspire that came out recently, but every player has to have a copy, and it's $25 right now. It's also in early access on Steam, so I'm not sure about that. But it has 3D map creation tools. I don't know how.
Like there's been a few meme things come up. Like there was a 3D D&D client that showed up, but it's like, okay, so how do I put my assets into it?
They don't Tabletop Simulator
talk
maybe,
about
or something like that.
No, well, Tabletop Simulator is one, but there was another one that was specifically for it was basically advertised as like a Roll20 replacement.
Okay.
And I believe it was built in Unreal. And no, that's not this. This is different. This at least shows you the process of putting together maps. The other one was like, okay, how do I put in my custom assets? How do you put custom assets in Tailspire? Does it tell you?
Oh, yeah, I'm not sure. That was something that I obviously wanted to know because I would be doing exactly that. They have asset packs that just keep coming out for free that you can download every now and then, but I don't know. I'd have to look at the page again and see if you can actually add new stuff yourself. It looks like one of the things that... Oh, yeah, so let's see. Oh, no, the boards themselves are shareable, apparently. But, there's all sorts of things that might end up happening. It's still in early access. So I don't know how much they've actually finished or provided. But one of the things that I thought was kind of interesting is that you apparently can build at the same time as players are connected. So you can finish the level.
We are definitely going to look into how we could expose spells and other emotes to being moddable. So it sounds like it's very, very locked down.
For now, yeah, probably.
And the first thing I'm looking at is what about 3D formats?
Yeah.
What about texture formats? Is this just your standard FBX, TGA, PNG, whatever, and they're not mentioning adding tiles in the game. Many even know how to model them. Tailweaver is a Unity project. Okay, so maybe they allow you to import assets in the same way Unity would. So you need to have Unity. Honestly, I'm very, very skeptical about Unity, but it's not like you can be worse than Roll20. So it sounds like that is not accessible currently, but it may be something to keep an eye on for sure.
Oh, it looks
Especially
like there's
in your
something
case.
called a slab, and that's like a model that you can grab. Like there's an online website for it. So I don't know. Yeah, I think I'm not sure exactly, but and then a video on Steam starts autoplaying because why not? Literally had that tab open for like 3 minutes, just randomly get to hear some music. All right, so yeah, I think there's like value in potentially checking some of these out. I mean, obviously the ones that are premium are like, well, you got to figure out if that's, you know, super viable or whatever, and that's a bit of a financial thing. Like you got to figure out, is it worth, like, are you even capable of like buying it for other players, and then like, you know, all that shit. But yeah, I think stuff like that could work as like a medium interim piece where it's like, yeah, can we actually like your Unreal maps are obviously like you can theoretically have them be 3D. I don't know how much work it would take to render them out as a single object or whatever, if that would even be possible. But like if we can get some sort of client that can actually do that, then that would be great for everybody, you know? So we'd have to see. Because I mean, I don't know, like I'm not sure about the stage of your campaign right now. Is like I don't even know if the end is in sight at all. If you guys are going to continue in theory for like years on end, then maybe it would be worth it, right, to switch over.
I won't live long enough to finish it.
It's that good
For sure.
that long,
like it's at our current rate, I don't think 10 years is even realistic. Because we've slowed down so much because of scheduling in particular, but there's a lot of ground to cover even if I condense a lot of it.
Right.
And like this university we've been there for longer than a year, I think now. And I thought we would have been actually out of the whole maze area by this point. But that is so long away. And that's part of the reason why I've been coming up with alternative progression mechanisms is because it has taken so long. And I can't advance player levels like any reasonable amount at this point for what little is actually happening. So we're introducing alternative mechanisms instead because it doesn't make sense for the player levels to be advancing so quickly when not really a lot is happening.
Yeah, but it's so much time is passing in real life.
Yeah,
so.
Absolutely. So, you know, you got to hand the player stuff. So it realistically, you know, if my health and living circumstances somehow don't get worse, which the trend of things is always so much the contrary. You know, and if the players want to continue playing is the other thing. At our current rate, like 20 years.
Yeah, okay.
Easily.
So it would definitely be worth it to take, you know, get a move on and grab another thing then. Something that would...
It absolutely, we would like to have permanence, preferably in something that we have agency over.
Yeah.
Because I don't trust any of these third-party systems whatsoever, especially anything based on servers, anything based on middleware, anything that is locked down and doesn't give me open source. Just the way in which hardware and operating systems have been going.
Oh, yeah.
They're becoming increasingly locked down, more and more resistant to backwards compatibility. You know, it is getting harder and harder to support stuff. I mean, even Steam is abandoning the only functional operating systems right now. And
yeah. Well,
it's
only 1% of users are using that only functional ones.
Yeah, well, a lot of people don't have the choice either. So it's...
Dude, the real fucking... I know we always say dystopia starts now. It's not already been happening, guys, but...
It's already happening.
Windows 11 would actually be the real dystopia, dude. Like, I'm using Windows 10, and I'm saying Windows 11 is where dystopia 100% starts. Dude, like, I cannot handle how fucking stupid that operating system is. It's so...
And Windows 12 is going to be even worse.
By the way.
And the hardware manufacturers are forcing you into that.
Yep.
Like, the only reason I'm on Windows 10 is because the hardware needs it. That's the only reason.
Yeah.
And because of DirectX 12. And it's... By the way... and it's just it's a dreadfully bad operating system. It really is. Everything about it is slower. You have less control over how it behaves. The updates are kryptonite that fuck with shit constantly. And a large chunk of things just don't behave like they should. And I mean, Windows 7 wasn't amazing, but it's really like the best that Windows has gotten, except for maybe like Windows 2K. And it's like, okay, there's going to be problems when stuff gets updated, but the problems are not being fixed. The ancient issue with Explorers is still there, and the performance is still bad, and like they're not adding any meaningful improvements. There are no meaningful improvements whatsoever. And just like the way that Windows exposes the customization of the interface, dude. Like, how long did it take for Windows 10 to actually give you a proper dark mode? Way too fucking long.
Yeah.
And like, it's just like common sense. It's like, why would you even release the product without this? And just, dealing with like backgrounds or drivers or whatever is still a headache. And now they just want to make it all Chrome. So fuck that.
I don't know where they get off doing shit like that, honestly, but
it's just money. It's just the data miners want you to use Chrome so they can mine you. That's literally what it is, because Chrome phones home on every single thing you do. Every single website you go to, every URL, every IP connection. It phones home, their crawlers come. And then China comes. And it's just, they pay for this. That's valuable information to them. And
mental.
Why not do it with Windows too? Because it's all about tracking you. There's not been nearly enough pushback against telemetry and tracking and all this other shit. I mean, in some cases, it makes sense to have analytics that tell you how the operating system is behaving across a wide variety of hardware and scale of users you can't possibly test on your own. It helps to have some of these diagnostics information. But what is, in many cases, being harvested is not safe at all. And I mean, in many cases, the telemetry in Windows 10 has been overblown in what it actually is there for. But in many cases, it is like the forcing of upgrading the TPM stuff and then building Chrome into it, which is already a black box in many cases. And, Google is not a trustworthy company that anybody should be associating with whatsoever, but they keep doing it. There is no reason for a user to trust any of these companies with anything at all. And that in itself should be very concerning. Very concerning. Windows should be shedding a lot of this dead weight instead of embracing it. But, ever since Ball Boy shined his last orb, it's just been a steady fall downwards to the bottom. And
I miss the guy who yelled developers while sweating profusely.
Yeah. Microsoft is just such an overbloated, disgusting, diverse company that just I just don't like. I mean, Windows has no competition at all, so it's really like the biggest root of the issue is there is absolutely no drive for them to actually do meaningful improvements to it. So they're not going to. They're going to do whatever just keeps making more money, and that means harvesting more information, pushing more ads, building ads into the operating system, tracking what you do. Trying to get you, pushing you towards things like microtransactions. And didn't Microsoft at some point say there will be no further Windows installations after 10, and now they're just going to try to do annual releases like all the game developers do?
Yeah, they certainly haven't kept their promises in any capacity.
Like there's absolutely no reason to ever go beyond 10 until DirectX and hardware forces you to go beyond it, and then.
Which is all a grift anyway. It's not like it's required.
It's not at all required. It is literally just there just to force you to do it because there's deals. Because nobody would ever move beyond Windows 7 if their fucking Call of Duties didn't require them to do so. And then corporate machines, of course, coming pre-installed with this shit on top of it is another big one. It's quite rare for people to actually build their machines these days.
Yeah, that's fair. I think I remember the stats being like 1.2% of all PCs or something.
That's terrifying.
Something like that. So maybe
that's actually terrifying.
Maybe it's slightly more now, or maybe it's not. But I mean, because I know that people will buy graphics cards, but I think that's after they've bought a prefab, right? Like they upgrade
after they bought a fucking compact.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's a very a niche within a niche kind of deal for like the PC enthusiast crowd that actually wants to purchase.
It's actually
and buy their
terrifying,
own
honestly.
thing, so, you know,
I just can't imagine using a machine for your day to day, whether it's you just casual playing games without understanding all of its functionality and having some agency in the quality of the hardware that was put into it.
yeah. No, yeah, I would never want to do that myself. I would find it really quite disturbing to be faced with a situation where my my main way of interacting with my system's creation is just deciding like which store to buy it from wholesale or whatever. But
Whatever fucking malware they put on it that's at hardware level, you can't even do anything about.
yeah, I mean, sometimes that's in the system itself anyway, but like from the hardware pieces. But hopefully not as widespread, you know. And the fact that you always get this pre-installed shit, like you were talking about too, doesn't help things.
Well, like with tablets, like I had that old tablet the bank gave me, and I had another one my grandmother bought that she gave me, which was only a little bit newer, and they're both Samsung, and it's Android, and I like. How do people put up with this shit? It's so bad.
Yeah.
You have no control over anything on the system. The system actively hides the ability to shut shit off. You can't remove 90% of the garbage on it. It literally does nothing but consume resources and space. You can't install games to external storage at all. You get a SIM card that costs you a fucking arm and a leg. You can't even install anything to it.
Reasonable.
You used to be able to, according to research on the internet. You can't anymore. It's all to force you to buy a newer model with more storage. And then you have all these Unity games like Fate Grand Order that apparently they can't actually delete files out of, so it just keeps growing.
Yeah. Absolutely insane.
Which wouldn't be an issue if I could just install it on what actually has space. No.
And it's not like you can move a bunch of other stuff to that drive anyway, right? So the SD
Yeah, a lot of stuff you can't. No, and like many games, they say you can move it to the external, it moves the APK file. It's like 20 megs.
Yeah.
Not that 5-6 gigs of fucking data they've got. And then there's the general usage, like the touchscreen is just a meme. It's just perpetually dirty. Great. Whoever thought touchscreens were a good idea again, they deserve a goddamn slap. It's never going to work. It's just, you're always struggling to keep the goddamn screen clean. It's fragile as all fuck. The sensitivity
the other
is
thing that
just
reminds me
awful
of
to
is,
use.
I remember Elon Musk saying this somewhere, the throughput, that like the actual bandwidth between your brain and what you want to say is way smaller with thumbs, you know, like the keyboard is way faster than that.
Yep.
And now you have to use your thumbs.
Well,
or
you
fingers
see the
to-
messages I type on my tablet with the biggest thing I can get on. Like, my fingers may not have the dexterity they used to because of the arthritis, but it is a serious chore to type anything on a fucking tablet, much less a little cell phone.
Yeah. Yeah, imagine if it was even smaller, which is what most people are using.
No, I don't understand how people do that. I guess it's the advantage of being a soy boy where fingers are like perpetually that of a toddler's.
I guess
You
they.
can
I mean,
operate
I
these tiny
usually,
little
if I have
screens.
to, I'm using the swipe feature, and that like auto completes words, but it regularly fucks it up. So, and
Yeah, my auto-completed words are pretty much all racial slurs on there. Universally. Or a series of like A's or whatever.
I like that. There was a point earlier where I initiated a ready check in Divinity yesterday, and it says your name, and I totally forgot that my character name was just it was like 30 capital A's, and it's just and like just everybody immediately started dying in a fit of laughter because of that. So that's good. So.
Oh dear.
So yeah, I think, you know, when I to your point about like wanting source control of the client, I 100% agree. It's like a huge requirement to make sure that we, like, for whatever we end up doing and whatever we end up coming up with, we will want to, you know, if we're going to end support for it, or maybe even regardless, it might be a good idea to do the move of releasing the action, because otherwise, you could get into a point where like this feature isn't ever implemented because it's not useful for us or whatever. It's a little bit different than like a game engine or a product or whatever, because we're not like trying to sell it in the same way. At least I don't know. I'm pretty sure we wouldn't want, like, the whole point is that like there's nothing good out there already. So Like it would probably just end up being donationware or something, I guess, if I had to speculate on it. But yeah, it feels like there really isn't that much that's out there. I don't know what's going on with that. Like, I don't know why nobody's even trying to make something that's actually useful.
Because most people are willing just to settle for Roll20.
Yeah, that's pretty.
There's not many people who are into this that are using Roll20 and putting up with it that are capable of making something better.
Right.
A lot of like the argument I've been given for Roll20 is it's just easy to jump into because it's a web page. But I mean, you run shit on your phone, you run games on your computer, like it really is no different than that. It should be no different than that. And I don't think like with Foundry or anything like that, it is any different than that. So like to me, that argument is silly. The issues would be from the side of like with Foundry, you're transmitting the data to potentially 4 or 5, 6 players. And if you're in Canada, that can be a real troublesome spot because if you're trying to stream music or whatever on top of it, that can use quite a bit of upload and it's consistent bandwidth usage. So if it struggles, it's going to really degrade the play. Like I haven't seen or used it, so I don't know precisely what happens when the load turns out too much.
Yep.
But I presume you're going to like not see tokens or maps for a while. While Roll20, it takes over 10 minutes to not have a blurry like 2x12 representation of a map because it can't load the 50 megabyte PNG to Amazon Web Shard turn the 5 megabyte JPEG into because Reddit doesn't even know what happens on their own end of the fucking software. But even then, it's like 50 megabytes is not really that much, especially for an Amazon Web Shard. Why is it so slow? Probably overselling. But like it takes a long time to load and you can't see anything when it's doing that. It's just a blurry goddamn mess. Tokens may not load at all. And like, so what happens when we do it in like Foundry? You know, there's just unanswered questions. But it's like that in that regard, the quality of the service is at least in your control if you are running a decent. I mean, Foundry supports running it off of a web server too. So, you know, if you got the money, just pay for your own bloody Amazon Web Shard. And, you know, like I said before, they don't seem to really give much of a shit of what you have hosted on this. I guess it's like outright CP or something, but it's it would be more reliable than Roll20. So to me, like the argument that it's a web page is convenient holds absolutely no water whatsoever.
Yep. I have to agree with that. I mean, if you're going to be an enthusiast to the degree that you're actually going to play a tabletop role-playing game, digitally or otherwise, you're probably not going to shy away from using, like, actually having a computer to do it on, you know?
Plus, the service is always experiencing lag, dropout, rolls break all the time. They treat it as their development service, so they just push out stuff entirely untested half the time. And shit just is breaking all over, especially in the last couple of years. It's been really bad. And, like, on your end, running local software and then direct IP connecting to it, you only have to worry about your connection, and your dudes only have to worry about their connection. Cutting out a middleman is always a good thing.
Yep. Absolutely agree. It just makes it a lot more, like, the reason why we're stressing the whole idea that you should have some control over it is because, like, that makes the service more stable and allows you to actually invest in the idea that you're going to run, you know, a campaign that takes years to resolve, like yours.
And if you've got something to fix, you can fix it.
Yes.
It's just, you know, you're not relying on somebody who's, like, the second Roll20 stops becoming profitable from grifting off of their marketplace or packages or whatever, it is going to drop right away.
Yeah.
Because it's a consistent cost paying for the cloud storage. And cloud storage is not really that cheap. And that's not a cost they're going to uphold if it becomes a loss at all. It's going to evaporate immediately. Or it'll be sold to Tencent or something who wants the data off of it. And then it'll evaporate immediately, or it'll get completely gutted. It's just, there's no permanence in it.
Yep.
And your data is, like, I've tried to log a lot of my stuff locally, but there's still a lot of my stuff. I mean, even if I log all my stat blocks and stuff like that locally, and I have all my assets, the actual composition, the population of the maps, everything that's put together, the journal entries, that's all on that storage. If that goes down, if they have a database failure, like Epic right now is struggling with something wrong with their database from a failed transition, it's fucked up their marketplace. If something gets fucked up in Roll20 that destroys the data, or they sell it off, or they close it down, I lose everything.
Yes.
And even if they were out of the goodness of their neckbeard hearts to give you some way to download like JSON files, just something, what the fuck am I gonna do with that? I can't put that shit in Unreal or Foundry or whatever. So it's like you depend upon people to create this software that can just like either translate the data, or you got to write it out. Or really, in my case, like let's say I want to switch to this thing you talked about, or to Foundry or to Unreal. I had to rebuild everything from scratch.
Yep.
Like it's just like, don't make the same mistake I did and make it on Roll20, because when you're looking at a long project like this, you're just like praying to Allah every single day this service doesn't get any worse, which it's been consistently getting worse.
Yeah.
And it doesn't just fucking get yanked out from under you, because you will just lose so much. And then you've got to spend a lot of time rebuilding that scales proportionally to how much work you put in. And I've got so much shit on Roll20. The very process of trying to start today could take me forever to even begin to just pull off just the stat blocks and crap.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a real scary situation to find yourself in, where there's just no security, no stability, and nothing under your feet that's solid. It could just all vanish momentarily, which is...
There's no security in cloud storage whatsoever. Anyone who thinks there is has not been paying attention to the news.
One of the things that I keep thinking back to as our sort of conversation here winds down is the main goal of this was to create like a working alternative that really stresses for the role-playing side. And I think from what I've been able to talk about on this show, from what we talked about on the Roundtabletoptalk and what I've written down independently, I do feel like we have a lot of potential for a lot of the stuff. Is like, if it is more about like the role-playing aspect, the simultaneous turn thing I can kind of take or leave. It's one of those things where it's like, might end up morphing things in a way that I actually don't end up liking. The attractive part to me is the fact that it probably streamlines the actual like combat and makes it more interesting about like anticipating your opponents. And I think that could lead to some interesting role-playing situations where, you are deliberately trying to do something on the side of like anticipating the movement that an opponent whose kind of which you have fought before. And it's like, okay, I know this kind of enemy likes to do this kind of thing or whatever. So that could allow you to like benefit from paying attention and benefit from like being aware of the battlefield, of the area, like what's in your environment, like what can you actually use, like what are some things that you have access to. And I think that kind of thing is really useful and has some interesting consequences, or can have some interesting consequences anyway, if you're able to like set it up properly and really pay attention to the environment to begin with. So that's one of the things that I'm really interested in exploring is like, can I make it so that the environment's really neat? Can I make it so that we have, some really cool little traits that you have at your disposal for being able to interact with things, prepare for things, like the whole preparation versus execution, like which one do you actually do? And I think that works really well with the idea of the simultaneous turn system. And probably resolves like a core issue I generally tend to have with turn-based combat anyway. It's just that like it feels really artificial that you would just have like one person go and then another person go, when in theory it's all supposed to be happening anyway. So you actually don't really ever exist on this. Like, so one thing that can happen if there's hard CC in the game, for example, as anybody playing like Divinity or any of these other fucking turn-based RPGs will know, is you can just end up getting stunned before your turn and then you do nothing. And it's like, well, I would at least like to be able to do something before the status effect stops me from being able to do something the next turn. Like, at least give me a turn. But you can actually get stun locked out of a fight and then die.
Yeah.
And have no recourse.
That has happened in my games.
Right. And that's an extreme example, right? But like that, because that can happen.
Even without stuns.
Right.
Like Fear. Fear, rule as written, can do that. Because, like, say, for example, in the last Albion fight, HKS got feared. And rules is written, so long as the subject of your fear is in line of sight, you can't move towards them. Well, he literally couldn't do anything because he just kept failing to save every single fight, and he's a melee. Like, it basically acted as paralysis. And it lasted for, like, most of the fight. Because he just, like I said, had decent stats, couldn't make a save for a damn. So we had to errata fear that you can move at half speed.
Okay.
To stop that kind of interaction.
Right. Like,
CC in turn-based is really strong, even stronger than you might normally think.
Yeah. And so I think that would probably contribute positively if everybody was at least guaranteed one action before something debilitating happened to them, and then probably design stuff that doesn't just stun you in the first place, or like need some setup. Like one thing that I do think Divinity did kind of well in the sequel is they had the system where you had to get shocked twice before you were actually stunned, and then like they kind of fucking bypass this with some rules anyway. Like if you shock blood or something, you're just fucked. But like in general, it made some of the spellcaster interactions healthier, and then obviously they had like the physical armor versus magic armor thing, and like maybe you could do something more nuanced than that, where you might have resistances towards certain things, but like basically if I get shocked by a bolt of lightning, I should probably also lose some physical armor to that, you know what I mean? Like it would probably damage my armor in addition to like breaking through my resistances. So like I think you could do something more interesting and nuanced than that. But I understand why they went for that more simplistic model, because it, like in a digital game, it kind of makes things a little bit easier and simpler. I don't know if I would have like that's the other thing that I'm not sure about is like, should I have actual HP values, or should I be entirely conditional on like you attacked his head is now severed? Like, okay, like that's like very simple. There's the chance that it also becomes very binary, but like that also contributes towards something that is a little bit of a misgiving I have, where in a digital game, by necessity, if you are like status effects aside, which sometimes do show up, if you're 1 HP out of 100, but you like it's your turn, you can do all the things you can normally do as a character that's full HP. And so like maybe making it so that if I attack, if I shoot you in the arm or I blow your hand off or something, like that actually negatively impacts your ability to be dexterous in the fight. Like that's a significant like loss. Then you have to like deal with that wound, and again, like it doesn't turn this into a total disaster immediately, because you would still have your first turn guaranteed. And probably, unless you were really fighting a fight you weren't supposed to be fighting, which would be set up elsewhere, like that's a case where I think that's a case where you would 100% want to be in a situation where like basically in your case, like your cases where you like deliberately say like, don't, like if you fight this guy, you got to be really prepared, and then they like fight him unprepared, or initiate a siege like unprepared or whatever, like yeah, you're fine killing them then, because like they didn't heed the warning, they didn't like play well, so to speak, right? And so like I kind of think about it in those terms. It's like, barring cases like that where they're like angering somebody with crazy powers above what they can do, or like in a domain where they are significantly more powerful than they were the last time, and it's like very obvious or whatever, like that's a case where, assuming the actual combat is fair, and assuming that like it's set up in a way that can be intuited, and assuming it's not just like out of the blue or whatever, you would just design a system where it's really hard for you to get significantly impaired or incapacitated, or be significantly less useful in the fight. Like it would just not be possible for that to happen in the average encounter that's like appropriate to your level of power or whatever, right? And so I was getting at that thinking, that probably means that I would have to design all of the early NPCs to not be like, either they are so obviously like really powerful so you wouldn't want to pick a fight with them, or they're all actually within the average, like the rough power level, if you decide you want to attack them or something, right? Mm-hmm. So, and then that goes back to the whole idea of like, since we're trying to stress role playing, like maybe you do have to play a little bit before you figure out who your actual human party members are, right? Like maybe that's like a consistent rule we try to play around, or at the very least, maybe we try it initially and see how it flows, because I feel like that's got a lot of potential too. Obviously, it would also depend on the players if they even like the idea of doing any sort of potential PvP, or like, whatever the case may be, so that there's mischief opportunities as you were describing it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I don't know. Like we're kind of wrapping up the conversation at this point. But if you had any closing thoughts on any of what I said about the encounters, or any of what I said about like the way that combat works or whatever, anything to think about before we move into Roundtabletop number 2, which is still a mouthful to say for some reason. I don't know why. I thought it was a really good name. But
I have heard about some, I think they're Star Wars turn-based systems that have entire sets of dice tables for stuff like wounding limbs and shit like that. And that's kind of what it was reminded me of, is these massive tables on, I forget what they were called, but there are these systems that have dice upon dice upon dice, where individual hits have like multiple potential tables of resolutions. And
it sounds a bit too involved.
It's kind of, yeah, even reading about it, it was really just a lot. And I don't know. Like it could certainly be interesting. When it comes to NPC power levels, I'm reminded of another discussion from way back about how some people felt that there should be nothing in the game world that is actually like more powerful than you, and you can literally just attack anything or anyone and expect to win. And it was just kind of funny because
Yeah, that's something I think I would wholeheartedly reject. Like it's a cosmic world about like grand scale. You're going to start at a lower power level than most of the, well, maybe not most of the entities in the whole universe, but like a significant chunk of them are going to be more strong than you, and a significant chunk of them you won't even be able to understand or comprehend initially. So,
it was like because this discussion came up because of the stock game for 5th edition being the Lost Mines of Phandelver. Underneath the town, there is like this. I think it's like it's an imprisoned creature that I think is like CR 15 or something.
Okay.
Or at least it was in this version. I don't know if he's changed. He may have changed it a little bit since the last one, but anyways, there's some stuff in there that's pretty strong. But there's like lots of tells that this thing is there, that it's dangerous, it's chained up, and doesn't really see you. The low level, like level 2 party, actually got into a scuffle with it and escaped without anybody dying. And the person's like, no, I never have anything like that in the game. And I'm like, okay, so what if you attack a king in his throne room? Can you expect to win? And they're like, oh, sure. I'm like, but I don't know. It's like these. I can think of any innumerable circumstances where you just are going to be outmatched even against low-level enemies. And it's just like, well, in my world, you have all these enemies, but they don't have like the outright like unkillable armor that a lot of things in like 5th edition would have, like with invulnerability or save or dies that just are like, I have like invulnerability in 5th edition, literally just like 10 minutes of invincibility against anything except I think for maybe like disintegration ray or whatever. And it's like there's just like these switches you pull that just break everything. And then wish, of course, is another really bad one. And it's like, none of that stuff really exists. Like statistically they're there that you could fight them. It's just those stats are still in such a manner as to scale appropriately to the world and to compensate for the fact we don't have these really binary interactions instead. And like they were written out, and at any point you could try to fight them. It's not really recommended. I mean, you can go ahead, but rather than having something that's literally just, oh, you died, it's like, well, you are going to die, it's just actually going to be granular in such a way that makes sense. But at the same time, it's like, well, if everything is the same general strength as you, or you could already fight everything, then what really is the point in getting stronger anyways?
Yeah.
So like there's just, I don't know, like that there is just that many weird different approaches to it, which I guess, I mean, you can kind of see that as the flexibility of the system is you can most certainly run it that way. And I just try to balance everything out through reads and stuff like that. So beyond that, I started writing out, because we're reaching this stage in SS where we have dismemberment showing up now. We have one particular opponent they run into where literally contact with her causes a dismemberment check. And HKS has already been subjected to this, of course, because why not? And regeneration does exist. And then in Autumn Wind, there was a character they did not fight who had an entire hand-to-hand moveset based on destroying organs and limbs. And that's something we'll probably see transition to more units in the game as time goes on. Other than that, I've just kind of dealt with it as it's happened. Like in the rare case that they try to target subsystems that are not necessarily written out, I will just resolve it as whatever, it makes sense for that to happen. So with some enemies, you can target their weapons, but you're not necessarily going to be able to destroy them because it's like a core part of their body. So it just does damage to them or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they would have to actually die for it to become inoperable or whatever.
Yeah, basically. And so, yeah, it's definitely something I thought about a lot, because conventionally with melee and weapons and attacks and stuff, it's just roll attack, right? It's not very interesting, not very engaging. That's what everything really amounts to. So one of the things I've definitely been thinking about is how to bring back decision-making into physical combat for these games.
Yeah.
And certainly having, more subsystem interaction is one way to do it. So within like a simultaneous turn non-dice roll system, that can be certainly one way to explore the decision making.
Yeah, the idea is basically like what we want out of the experience of doing combat, especially if it's going to be some sort of physical combat that is a little bit more on the simpler side, is you want to be able to look at that and say like, well, I still have decisions to make that are interesting. I still want to be able to like pick a target that's actually a valid target, even within a single creature or enemy. Like, especially, I mean, the thing is, like, the opening setting is set on this, again, these are automata, so it would stand to reason they would have subsystems you can specifically target that would be, you know, like, it would be functional. It wouldn't be like, you know, severing a head or an arm where it's debilitating blood loss. It's not the same deal as that. You might be able to find, like, a very specific spot where if you attack, it's similar to, like, a headshot or whatever, but you know, you can at least like rip off a turret or something, right? And then like reduce their combat effectiveness. So there's going to be lots of room to explore that just intuitively with the types of enemies that are going to be among the most common on the ship. And that gives you a lot of room to explore that angle pretty well, I think.
You would say they're among us? They're crewmates?
Yeah. There you go.
Would any of them happen to be sussy?
I never, it took me a really long time to figure out the origin of that because I never played. I almost said Fall Guys. That's not even the game Among Us. Yeah, obviously.
They're basically the same thing.
Wouldn't surprise me one bit.
I've never played them either, but both of them involve vor as far as I know.
How does it feel knowing that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, played Among Us with Pokimane on Twitch as a way to get votes? How does that
Aren't they basically the same person?
Yeah, probably. Might as
They're
well.
just both like corporate shells.
Yeah.
That would cry tears of blood if like white males entered a building within the same province.
Why not? They are absolutely Canadian.
It is free money, I guess. So why not after all?
Speaking of free money, you can find our coffee page on the description. I don't know. I had no segue for that one. Got it. Yeah, so, yeah, I guess that's...
You got to give me coffee directly, though.
Yeah.
I don't get any proceeds. You got to come to my shack here and give me coffee.
Yeah, you got to express delivery some coffee. Actually, I should actually do that at some point, like when I get my next big check here from these fucking Russians that are hosting this totally not match-fixing tournament. I should jump in and mail you some high-grade coffee and see what you think of it. There you go. You can look forward to that. That's a literal coffee purchase. But all right, guys.
I've had a few mail-ins. One of them was signed by the Justin Trudeau, the Sheik of Ottawa, and the other one was hand-drawn dicks. So I've had streamer mail moments.
Okay.
Without being a streamer or having a mail address.
Interesting. I would blame HKS. I don't know who else even knows your address, though. So.
It wasn't him, though, sadly.
Well, in that case, I would imagine it had to be that Mark guy that made like a campaign about you breaking your dick on a supply depot and then having to.
No, I'm thankful people like that have never known me. I would be very concerned.
Yeah.
I'm certainly would not be brave enough to open unknown mail from strangers off the internet like some streamers do, where they just get what they would hope to just be anthrax and just be done with it.
Yeah, at least then it's a quick worse instead of a fucking prank. I still can't believe that like iDubbbz did the bad unboxing videos and it was literally he's just like opening up like there's a couple of parts where like people are just mailing him dog shit and stuff. I was like, okay,
at least it's just dog shit.
Yeah, it's like this is very reasonable behavior. Has to get like it's screened obviously by other people and it's just stupid. Well, I think Just Stupid is a great way to end this show. We've been going for, holy shit, we've been going for almost 4 hours. If you can believe
it was a while, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's a little bit of idle time, but we can
start rambling about D&D. It just
goes.
It's
Yeah.
just
this
a
is
lot
as long
of
as D&D session sometimes is. So
yeah.
There you go. You guys have finished it. And yeah, I suppose that'll do it for us. So, of course, we'll be back eventually. Maybe it'll be another 4-hour epic, and maybe it won't be. But at least it was over 3 hours, so you got your threes worth. And yeah, I guess that's it. Smoke weed, homie.
All right, smoke weed.